Let's now finally render the recipe in the user interface. And so let's start by creating a new views file here. So recipe view.js, and then also right away import it here. Okay, and now simply duplicating this line here and replacing search with recipe. Okay, so again, we're going to import everything into recipe and then use these different functions as like methods on this recipe view object. Okay, so the most important function that we want in recipe view here is to, of course, render the recipe. So export and render recipe, where we put in, and I forgot, of course, the equal sign. So we put in the recipe and then we render the markup that we're going to create here. So just like before, we create a variable called markup and give ourselves a nice template string. This here should be mark up. And now let's actually get our HTML code here. So we have an element called recipe already in our DOM, and what we're going to insert in here is basically all of this HTML code here. So all of this. So let's grab it. And that was too much. So that is our HTML. So let's get ahead and paste it here. Whoa, what's going on here? That doesn't look correct at all. Okay, so that is a lot of code and it looks quite confusing. So let's figure out what exactly we have to replace here. So first off, we have the image here. And so that's the first thing that we're going to replace. And so remember, we passed in recipe, and the recipe is obviously the recipe object. And so in there we have the property called img. And so that's where the URL to our image is stored. So image. Then as an alt text, let's just use the title. So recipe.title. Okay. And I'm actually going to go ahead and copy this one here because it's really always the same. Then in here, we also have the title. Okay. Then down here, let's create some space here. We have the recipe details. So we start with the time. And so in here, we want the recipe time. So instead of 45, it's the custom time. Then here it is the servings. So 4 servings, and now it is recipe.servings. Let's take a look if that's correct. So yeah, so we have time and servings, right? Down here, we don't really have anything important for now. And then next up, we have the ingredients, and it's this huge list of stuff. And for now, let's get rid of this. Not all of it, but at least all of them but one. Okay, and so I'm going to come back to the ingredients a bit later here. For now, I just want to finish with the directions, where we have the publisher here. So the pioneer woman turns into recipe.author, and then finally down here we have the URL. So that's where the directions of this recipe actually are. So our API doesn't return us the directions on how to cook the recipe. It just gives us the link where the user can then go ahead and find it. Okay, so that is the markup here now, except the ingredients. And before we move on, let's actually render it here with insert adjacent HTML. And so let's go ahead to our, where is it? Yeah, our base file, and create a field here for recipe. And then go ahead and select that element. So document.querySelector. And remember that is actually called recipe also in the DOM. So give it a save, close it. And so we actually didn't import it yet. Okay, so let's simply copy it from this one here, so that we can now use it in here. So elements.recipe, dot insert adjacent HTML, and this one we want right at the beginning. So after begin, and of course markup. All right, and now about our ingredients here. So of course we don't know beforehand how many ingredients there are going to be, and so we have to do it here obviously with a loop. Okay, so what we're going to do here is to basically take our ingredient and then loop over them. And so remember that inside a template string, we cannot only just put in the variables, but we can do all kinds of stuff. So recipe.ingredients.map, and so this will loop over them and create a new array that we can then use. And so in there we then have access to each of the elements, obviously. And so what we're going to do for each of the elements is to actually call a new function that I'm going to create in a second, which is render ingredient. Or actually, let's call it create ingredient, because it will not really render anything to the screen. So we will not create real DOM elements here. Okay, so create ingredient. Let's put it up here. It does need to be exported. And so this is just what I put into the function ingredient. Yeah, now it's correct. And actually we don't even need this, because such as before, we're actually just going to return a string from this one. Okay, so where's the code for this? And here we go. Whoa, what's happened here? Let's go ahead and put this right. And all right, now all we have to do is to replace this stuff here. So first off, we have the count, which is ingredient.count, remember. Then we have the unit, which here is gram. And then finally here is the ingredient itself. And right now I'm actually remembering something, which is that in a recipe, there's still something that we have to do. Okay, but let's leave that one for later. I hope I don't forget that I have to change something there. So this here will return this string to us that will then be put into this new array, but we don't want an array here, right? We just want a string. Okay, so the result of this here, we will simply join it. So join it, and that's it. Okay, so again, this here returns an array in which each of the elements is the markup for one of the ingredients. Okay, but we don't want an array, of course, inside our HTML. We just want regular text. And so we can simply join all of the elements together as a huge string containing the markup for all of these ingredients. And of course, once again, we could have done this all inside of this callback function here instead of separating it into a new function, but I think it's much cleaner having it like this. And with that done, let's actually test it out. So we have a search controller, we have the recipe controller, and now instead of logging it to the console, we want to render it, obviously. So first off, we clear the loader. So just like before, and actually we don't have any loader yet, so we first have to put it there in a second. But let's just start by putting the recipe view.render the recipe. And now we of course have to pass in the recipe. And so where's the recipe? Well, it is at state.recipe, obviously. Okay, so this clears the loader, but we still have to render the loader. And we do that right at the beginning here at prepare UI for the changes. Right? So we need to render the loader. And now we need to pass in the parent, remember. So we always need to pass in the parent so that the loader knows where to actually display itself, basically, okay? And so this one here is now at elements.recipe, remember? So the element that we just created before. So we render the loader, then we create the recipe, get the data, calculate all this stuff, then finally clear the loader once the data is back, and then render it. And so let's test it out now. And you see that it's already doing some stuff here. And that's because this one here is still active. And whoa, indeed, here it is. So we have our homemade pizza here. So at the time, the servings, all of the ingredients, it's all there. And also here the author. But let's test it out here. Right, pizza. So let's try it with this one here, for example. And now I see something. So we have to clear this old recipe before we can load a new one, okay? So let's wait for this one and then take care of that clearing. So next up, we need to clear this up, okay? So recipe view, and then simply export. So elements dot recipe dot inner HTML set to nothing. Okay, and so now each time that we want to load a new recipe, we first need to clear it. So recipe view dot clear the recipe. Okay, so we clear the recipe, then we render the loader, and then all the rest happens. So let's search for pizza again. And now we have these two spinning here, but that's no problem at all. And so we have our best pizza dough ever. Let's take a look at this one here, for example. But I can already see that everything's working just fine, right? Oh, this looks delicious. Okay, and so yeah, this is already working just fine. Now remember that I said that I needed to change something here in the recipe model. And that's because here we have some of the units, but there can be other units like grams or kilograms. Okay, and so in that case, we cannot really recognize it as units because, well, in here, for example, where we find the index for the unit, we test if it's included in the unit short. And unit short does not include like grams or kilograms. And so let's add these to this array. And what I'm going to do is to actually create a new array simply called the units. And now I'm using ES6 destructuring. So remember, I can use these three dots to destructure units short. And what this will do is that basically it will separate it into its own components. So basically what this means is that instead of having an array inside an array, we will have all of these elements. So it will take these elements out and put them here. Okay, and then we can add like kilogram or just gram. Okay, so now all we have to do is to change it from units short just to units. Okay, and so now we can recognize kilograms and grams here as well. All right, now I'd already loaded because of the save that we did. So whenever we save something, then it reloads and it already has the hash here, and then it just loads the last recipe, which is actually perfect. So that's exactly what we want. Now let's just look at this example here, for example, and you will see in the ingredients, let's wait for it. Yeah, so you will see like this 4.5, 1.75, 0.25, and that's, well, that's not really ideal. So we want it back to like 1/4 or 4.5, like we had it initially, okay? And so we have to implement a function for doing that. So take a small break and see you in a second in the next video where we're gonna do exactly that. Hey there! So let's now continue building our recipe view. So in case you don't remember, where we left off is that we now want to create a small function which basically converts these decimal numbers here into fractions. So here, for example, we would have 4.5, here we would have 1/4, here we would have 1 3/4, and so on and so forth. Okay, now in order to do that, we will actually use a small external third-party package. Okay, because coming up with all this code would be a bit too much for this lecture, okay? And so it's a great opportunity to show you how to include once more external packages through the npm package manager. Okay, so the one that we're going to use is called fraction.js, and it's just a very small, very simple library which will allow us to basically put in a number and then get the numerator and the denominator out of that number, okay? So for example, if you were to input 0.75, it would give us a numerator of 3 and a denominator of 4, so 3/4. Okay, so all we need to do is to go ahead and use npm install fractional in our terminal, and not the process that is running, but of course this one here. And we also want to save it in our package.json file. And here we go. So let's take a look at that. And indeed, here you go. So fractional is now available to us. And so we can go ahead and import that. So we will import, and it is a named export. And I'm going to show it to you in a second. From, and now we just need the fractional. Okay, so again, for an external package installed through npm, we don't need to include the path. And actually this one is called fraction and not fractional. Okay, so this package doesn't have a really good documentation, but I know that it's exporting a named export called fraction because that's what we see here. So this here is another way of like importing modules with an older syntax. Okay, so this is like the Node.js syntax and not the ES6 syntax that we've been using. But it requires here this package and then the dot fraction. Okay, and so this here is the one that we're looking for and the one that we imported over here. So that's a named export. We can also see that in the index.json file. This is not really important, but just in case that you need to know this kind of stuff. So you see here module.export.fraction. Okay, and so you see that it has a named export called fraction. Okay, and so that's the one that we're importing here now at the top of our file. Okay, so let's create a function here called format_account, where we put in a count, so basically a number, and then we're going to return a formatted string. Okay, and we're then going to go ahead and use that here in the render recipe, or actually it's in the create ingredient. Okay, so it's right here. So we pass that into format the count. Okay, and this will then return a better formatted number here instead of the raw number that we have in our data, in our object. So let's start off by asking if we actually have a count. Okay, because it is possible that from our data processing, the count is actually undefined. Okay, so I mentioned before that there might be some unsolved cases here in the parse ingredients. Okay, and so it might sometimes return undefined here for the count. Okay, so usually that's not the case, but it might happen. And so in that case, all of this code that we're going to put here is not going to run, and instead we can simply return like something like this, so a question mark. Okay, so instead of it saying undefined in the user interface, it will have this question mark, which is going to look much nicer. Okay, so let's pretend that our example here is 2.5 as the count. Okay, so just that we have an example here in order to know how to build up this code. Okay, now this is then later going to translate into 2 and 1/2, right? So just as a reference. Now the first thing that I want to do is to separate the integer part from the decimal part, okay? Because imagine if it were 0.5, then it would look different. And let's actually take that as an example as well. So if it was 0.5, then we would just have a half, and that's of course a different situation here. So let's start by doing that. And now we are going to use something called destructuring, and I hope you remember that from the ES 2015 or ES6 section. So basically we can define two variables here at the same time, okay? And you're going to see why in a second. So we have our count, we will convert it to a string. So we use toString so that now we can split it. And of course we split it by the dot, okay? And so this will now be an array of a 2 and a 5, both as strings. So in this example here, so in 2.5, we will now have the integer as 2 and the decimal as 5. Now the only problem with that is that they are now both as strings and we want them to be as numbers. So we need a new array with them as numbers, and so we can use map, right? And what we're going to do in here is to simply parse int the element with a base of 10. Okay, and so now we're going to have 2 and 5 both relay as numbers in these two variables, right? Now, in case there is no decimal, which is perfectly acceptable, then we will simply return the count. Okay, imagine that we have just 2. So if we have 2, then we will have no decimal at all. And so we can simply return the original count, which was 2, and call it a day, because then our work is really done here at this point. Okay, so that's the first case actually. But now let's say if the integer is 0. And so that would be this case here, okay? So the integer is 0 and 5 is the decimal, so 0.5. And so now comes the case where we actually want to convert 0.5 to a string looking like this, so to 1/2. So how do we do that? Well, we're going to use the fractional library now. So we create a new variable, and I'm simply going to call it fr, which stands for fractional, and then we say new fraction based on count. Okay, so based on count, it will now create a fraction, and from there we can read the numerator and the denominator. Okay, and so what we're going to return here is a string, so a template string with fr numerator, then a slash, and actually without a space, and then fr.denominator. Okay, and so in case we have 0.5, well, this will then automatically calculate that the numerator is 1 and the denominator is 2. Okay, and so then we're going to return 1/2, just like this. And with that, we're done with the formatting in case that the integer is 0. Now, if it's not, so for example 2.5, well, then it's a bit different. So we still need to create a new fraction. But really, we don't want to create a new fraction of all of this. We just want to create a new fraction of the 0.5 still, okay? Because otherwise, we would simply end up with 5/2. So we could have this intermediate step here like 5/2. So that's the same, okay? But we don't want to display it like this, which is still 2.5, but it looks better like this, so 2.5. That's a bit more logical, right? It makes more sense. And so what we really want is to create a fraction just of the 0.5 part. And what that means is that we simply have to do count minus the integer, right? And then from there, it's actually pretty similar to this part here. Now all there's missing is, of course, and I hope you can guess it, the integer part. Okay, so we do this fraction here only with 2.5 minus 2, right? So count is 2.5 and integer is 2. So 2.5 minus 2 will be 0.5, which will be then 1/2. And then here in this return statement, in this template string, we put it back together basically. So we put our 2 and then our 1/2, which is this. Okay, so once more, this is really not for you to memorize how this specific case works. I just want you to be able to think logically, basically, about how we can achieve the goals that we need to achieve. Okay, and in this case, there are some particularities, like having to do it this way here, for example. Okay, but that should now work. So let's test it out. And we're still loading the same recipe. And indeed, here we go. So we have 4.5, 1 3/4, 1/4, and 1 3/4. So that's perfect. It works just fine. And now one last thing that I want to implement here is the functionality that basically the recipe that we select here from our search list will then get selected with this gray background here, okay? So right now it's this pizza here, and so this one is gray. And if I select this one here, well, then this one here stays gray, okay? So that shouldn't be all too hard. So let's go back to our code and quickly implement that. And we actually want this to happen when a recipe loads, but the DOM manipulation itself happens in the search view, okay? So let's actually add a method or a function here in the search view, and I'm gonna call it, let's say, the highlighted selected. And so for that, I need an ID, of course. And so let's see how we can do that. So what I'm going to do is a document.query selector, of course, because it's an element that's not yet there when we load the page. And so I can't do it in my base.js, so in my elements object that we've been using so far. So query selector, and so now we can use the power of the CSS selectors, because actually that's what we can input here. So this is like a CSS selector, as you know already. And so we can select all links based on attributes. And the attribute that we're looking for is the href. And we want to say that it has the ID. Simple as this. So we have a link always with the hash symbol and then the ID, right? So let's take a look at the search list just to make sure that we're on the same page here. So the links, they are, as you can see down there and also up here, it's always the hash and then the ID, right? And so we want to select the element that as an href attribute has exactly this ID here, so this hash. Okay, so you want to select it and then on the class list add the class of result link active. And again, I could put this here into the, where is it? It's not this one. So I could put it here into the element strings, but I'm not going to keep using this one here, because then if something changes, I will have to actually change it here in the element strings and also in the code that I put in here. So like in here, I would have to go ahead and add these element strings also here inside of all this markup that I input here. And that's way too much work. And so I'm not going to go that way. I'm just going to leave it as it is. Okay, so I'm just going to hard code these class names here, just as I do it also down here. Okay, so here we also have all of these hard coded basically. So results links, and that's actually the one where this new class will be attached. So result links, and if it's active, then we have result link dash dash active. And actually, yeah, it is results and not just result. And so now you see it's the same result link active and then result link if it is not active. Okay, so highlight selected. And now let's go ahead into our controller and say highlight the selected search item. And of course, we have to do it again in the recipe controller, because this only happens as soon as we load a recipe. All right, so search view dot highlight selected and then the ID. Okay, let's take a look at it. And it will not be perfect yet. And you will see why in a second. So if I hit it now here, well, then it's actually not really working at all. So let's check out the console here. So what do we have here? It says here that it's not a valid selector. And so let's see why that is. And yeah, we can close this one, I guess, for now, and the recipe as well. And so the problem here is that we are lacking some quotes here. Okay, so in CSS in the selector here, you have to put it into quotes. Okay, so let's check it out again. And now it says it cannot read class list of null. And so that's actually another error, which is that in this case, there was not really a search. And so how can we highlight a search result that's not really there? Okay, so let's add an if clause before that. So if state dot search. So if this exists, then it means that there was a search, and only then one of the search items can be selected. Okay, so let's wait for it. And it still says it can read class list of null. And I'm not sure why that is, so let's check it out again. And I guess it must be somewhere here. And yeah, so indeed, this quote is not in the right place. It should be here. Okay, so this is here what it goes inside the quotes. So just the ID with the hash. Okay, and of course this quote cannot be outside of this bracket. Let's try it one more time. Well, here it is. Now it's still not working. Oh, what's going on here? Well, it doesn't give me an error anymore. Let's try another one here. And it's still not working, as you can see here. And so let's try it one more time. Yeah, what's wrong is this. So when we add a class to the class list, we cannot put the dot selector because the dot is just, yeah, it's just a selector. And so here we really just need to pass in the class name and not a selector. Okay, and so that should now finally fix it. So let's try it out again here, writing pizza. And let's just click the first one here. And now it stays active. Okay, great. Now the only problem is that when I click this one here, then, well, the other is still active. And when I click this and this and this, and so all of them now, they stay active. And so a very simple solution to that is to, whoa, what's happening here now? I guess I clicked on too many of them at the same time. So what I have to do here is before adding the class to one of them, I have to remove it from all of them first. So let's just select them all first and put them into a variable. And I'm going to call it results array. And so I'm making array.from, which I already explained in the ES6 section. So document.query selector all. And the ones that I'm looking for is this results link. Okay, and again, I'm not using it from the element strings. Okay, but instead I'm simply hard coding it right here. So I'm not boring you here in these videos and make them longer and longer than they really have to be. Okay, so this is an array now. And now finally results.array. And then for each of them, let's simply remove the class. So element.classlist.remove. And then let's just get it from here. And what was that? Okay. All right, great. Just a final test now. Now it selects this one and let's hope it works. And indeed, it removes it from there. And yeah, so it really works. So I guess we're done with this part. Now there's just one thing that there's left to implement. So take a look at it here again. And that is, of course, the functionality where we can decrease and increase the servings. So you see, whenever I hit this button here or decrease button, then all of these numbers here, so the count numbers of the ingredients, they all get automatically updated. Okay, and so that's what we're still missing. And so we're going to take care of that right in the next lecture. So see you there. All right, let's now finish up this recipe part by updating the servings and the ingredient list whenever we click the increase or decrease buttons. And so you're actually going to learn something new in this video that we haven't talked about yet, which is another way of implementing the event delegation using the matches method on DOM elements. So again, the idea is to decrease or increase both the servings and the ingredients here whenever we hit these two buttons. Okay, so let's start with the model here. And I'm adding a new method here called update servings. And so we actually need to update the servings and also the ingredients. Okay, and we actually need also a parameter to this method here called type. Okay, and so that we in here can pass like a string saying decrease or increase in order to decide if we need to increase the servings or to decrease. Okay, so basically if we hit the minus button, then we will pass in decrease, and if we hit the plus button, then we pass in increase. Okay, so let's create a variable called new servings that will be set according to the type. Okay, so let's use the ternary operator here and say if it's dec, so it stands for decreasing, well, then this dot servings -1, else +1. Okay, now this will not update here this dot servings, it will simply then assign this value to type. Okay, or sorry, it will actually assign that value to new servings, okay? So if type is decrease, then new servings will be this dot servings minus 1, and otherwise it will be this dot servings plus 1. But it will not update right away this dot servings. So we have to take care of that later. And actually we can do it right now. Okay, but we still need that new servings variable here to calculate the new ingredients. And that's why we had to calculate it first. So this dot servings will be the new servings. All right, and now as for the ingredients, well, we need to update all of the count numbers, right? Because the count numbers that we have, they're valid only for the current amount of servings. So we assume that we have 4 servings and that the count that we have in the recipes are perfect for that. So if we then decrease or increase the servings, then we also have to update the counts. And we're gonna have to do that for all of the ingredients. So this dot ingredients, and remember that this is an array, and so let's use for each now. And for each ingredient, we will have to change the count. So inc.count will be, and remember that inc is the current value in the for each loop. And well, the count will be the old count dot count times the new servings divided by the old servings, basically. So this dot servings. Okay, so imagine that we had 4 and now we have 3. So if we had count before of 1, then, well, before we had 4 and now we have 3/4. Okay, so that makes sense. Now we can make this even better, because instead of having to repeat the inc.count here, we can simply put the multiply here, and then this will mean the exact same thing. All right, and only now we can then finally update the this.servings in the object. Okay, if we had done this here immediately, then we couldn't use it here. Okay, and so that's why we have to do it afterwards. So this updates the servings and both the ingredients in our data model. So that's the first part, and with that we're done. Next up, let's go ahead to our controller here and implement the event handlers for the 2 buttons. Okay, and so once more we have to use event delegation, because these buttons, they are not yet there by the time we load the page. So the only thing that is there is the recipe element, so all of this. And so that's where we will have to attach the event listener to, and then use the target property of the event in order to figure out where the click actually happens. So just like we did before, but in a slightly different form, as you will see in a second. So handling recipe button clicks. Okay, so we have a recipe controller, and then let's add it here also to the same thing. Later we will add then some more event handling to this, because remember we also have the like button and the add to list button. But for now we're just going to take care of the increasing and decreasing of the servings. So anyway, let's now attach the event listener to elements.recipe. So that's the element that's already there at load time, and then add event listener, click, and then we need the event, of course, so that we can then use the target on it. So last time that we did event handling, I showed you the element dot closest, right? Ah yeah, here it is. So here is the closest. Now this time around we cannot use closest, because there's more than one thing that we might potentially want to select. Okay, so here in this case we knew that we want to select the button inline. The problem was just that there are some elements in there which we could also click on. Okay, but right now the situation is different, because we have different elements that we might want to click on. We have the increase button, we have the decrease button, we later will have the hard button and the add to list button, and so we cannot use closest, because then it would be impossible to target these different elements. And so instead what we're going to do is to basically test what was clicked and then react accordingly. Okay, and so this time around we're going to use the matches method instead of closest. Okay, so let's use an if statement, and so event.target.matches. And now in here we can simply pass a CSS selector, just like with the document.query selector, for example. So we can simply say button decrease, which is the class name. So let's take a look at that. So search view, and that's not the correct one. So yeah, recipe view. So we have here the, where is it? And actually I see that we're missing here the class names. Okay, So let's add button decrease and button increase. Okay, so the first one is decrease for the minus, and for the plus it is increase. So what we say here is that we want to do something if the target matches button decrease, or we can add a second selector here, just like we do in CSS, button decrease, and then any child. So that's what this asterisk here means. So that's like the universal selector inside of this parent element. And let me, not here, so let me show you why that is. Because again, we might click on this element or on this element. And so like this, it will match these two elements here as well, okay? So because again, this turns out to be true if the target matches the button decrease or any child element of that button decrease. So that's what this part here of the selector means, all right? And so now we can then respond to this. So is clicked, okay? And now we can go ahead and copy this because it's pretty much the same for the next one. And I see that here is actually a mistake. Let's go ahead and copy this one. And here we want increase. And here also. So what do we want to happen in this case is, of course, state.recipe.update servings. And we pass in decrease. So that's the string that we defined to pass in. Okay, and then the same here for increase. All right, and then just log it to the console. So the entire recipe. Okay, just so that we can see the actual serving. Because right now it's not yet updated on the user interface, of course. State.recipe. Okay, and so yeah, let's test it out. Oh, something is happening. So you see the servings is now decreased to 3. Great. And now this is at 1.5. And this one here, yeah, this here is the original state. And so you see that it was 2 before, right? And so it's actually working, even updating here the ingredients. So you see 1 cup of mozzarella, and now it's just 0.75. And if I decrease it even further, then let's see what happens now. And indeed, it's 1 and 0.5. Now let's see what happens when I keep clicking. And the problem is that we now have negative servings, -5. And here we actually have not a number on all of these. Okay, so that's something we have to fix. And of course, that's very easy to do. So we can only do this if state.recipe.servings is greater than 1. Only then we can decrease it more. Okay, and here for the plus, well, there's not really a limit. I could put a limit here as well, like that we cannot put it to 100 people, but that's not really necessary. Okay, and so now finally, let's of course update the user interface as well. And so I'm gonna add a new method here, export and update servings again, and let's call it update servings ingredients. Okay, and we pass in a recipe, and based on that, we will then update everything. Okay. So again, we have to update the counts, and we have to update the servings or the ingredients. Okay, so it's not counts, it's the servings themselves. So the first one should be fairly easy. Document.query selector. And once again, I have to do the query selector here because this element is not yet there by the time we load the page. And so we're looking for the ingredient count. So where is that? Servings, it is this weird class name here. And ideally, we could have some class names that are specifically just for JavaScript. Okay, but well, in this case, I just did it like this. So no big deal, it still works, obviously. Okay, and so now just changing the text content to recipe.servings, and that's it. So this one is very simple. And now on to the next one. So basically what I'm going to do here is to select all of the ingredient counts and then update them one by one. So let's take a look at that. So count, so recipe count is their name. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and copy it. And so let's start by saving the selection here actually. So count elements. Okay. So array.from. And now we do our document.query selector all from recipe count. Okay. And now what do we do with this? Well, we do a simple for each loop. And now in here we actually need the element and also the index. And you will see why in a second. So we're going to change the text content of each of this element. And what do we change it to? Well, first of all, we use the format count function that we used before. And what we're going to put in here is the recipe.ingredients. Remember, that is the array. And now at position I.count. Okay? Makes sense? And that's why we needed the I here. Because basically we're looping over two arrays here at the same time. So we have the recipe.ingredients array and the count elements array. So we're using for each on this one, and then also using the current index to retrieve the value from the ingredients array. We could have done it the other way around. So the for each could be on the recipe.ingredients, and then we would use the index on the counter elements. So anyway, this should now be actually working already. So let's wait for the reloading of it and let's try it out. Well, that didn't really happen. And yeah, I guess that's because we didn't really call this function here. So that's a stupid mistake. So recipe view dot update servers ingredients, and in there we pass the recipe so state dot recipe. And the same, of course, also for the case that we increase the serving. Okay, so now we should be ready to rock. So let's try it. And here we go. It's working. That's fantastic. So we can increase it as we wish. Now let's try to decrease it even further. And it stops at 1, just as we defined. Okay, so perfect. Awesome. It's really working. And so with this, we actually finished this section. Well, we're going to add some more stuff here, namely this like button and this button here. But for now, it is really working. And so I hope you're proud of yourself for making it this far into the project. Next up, we're going to take care of this shopping list. So if you still want to continue this momentum, well, then just join me right in the next video. Welcome back to the next part of the app, which is the shopping list. And in this video, we will build our data model, where you will learn how and why to create unique IDs using an external third-party package. You will learn or remember the difference between the slice and the splice methods on the array. And also we will see some more use cases for the find index and find methods also for the arrays. So let's get to it. So as always, the first step is to create a new file in the models folder. So list.js. Okay, and once more, we want to represent the shopping list through an object. And so once again, we built a class here, which we used as a blueprint, of course, to then generate the list object later in the controller. So let's export default, of course, a class called list. Then the constructor. And this time around, we're not going to pass anything into the constructor. So basically, when we initialize a new list, we don't need to pass anything. All we want to do is to say that we have an items property set to an empty array. Okay, so this.items is an empty array. And so when we start adding new elements to the list, they will all be pushed into this items array. Okay, so basically all of the elements in our list will all be stored in this one property, this.items. All right, so let's now create a method to add a new item to the list. So we need to pass in the count, the unit, and the ingredient, right? Because our list is of course a list of ingredient, and it has the same structure as we have the ingredient data, okay? So remember, we always have a count, a unit, and an ingredient. And so that's exactly what we're going to add to the list as well, okay? So basically, we will have an array in which each of the elements is an object which will have the count, the unit, and the ingredient, all right? So let's actually create that item here, item, and it will have the count property. And now remember that we don't actually have to specify it like this, because it's just the same name. And so in ES6, that's not necessary. And the same goes for unit, and the same goes for ingredient. Now there's just one thing missing here, which is an unique ID. So we need each of the items to have an ID so that we can later identify them when we want to like update their count or when we want to delete them from the model and from the user interface. Okay? And so we gotta have a unique identifier for each of these items. And we did something very similar in the Budgety app, remember that? And back there we simply specified a number and said that whenever we added a new item, then the next one should have the next number as an ID. So the first one had 0, then the second one had ID 1, 2, 3, and so on and so forth. But that then created some problems. When we deleted some items, then we had to go figure out the next ID that we should use. Remember that? And so this time around, we're going to do it in a different way. So we're going to include a small library which will create unique IDs for us, okay? So let me show that package to you. And I already have it opened here, and it's called unique ID here on GitHub. Okay, and so it's very simple. So we'll always create unique IDs based on the current time, process, and machine name. Okay, and all we have to do is really use the unique function, and it will then return us a unique ID. Okay, so let's now install this package here and save it to our package.json file. And we can wait for it, and while it does its installation, we can already start including it here. So let's import unique ID from unique ID. But this one here is not correct. Unique. So yeah, it's just really like this weird way of spelling it. So unique ID from unique ID. And so let's add the ID property. On ID, we want to have unique ID. And that's it. So this will create a unique identifier for each of the items based on this small library. Just take a look if it already installed. And indeed, here it is. So unique ID on version 4.1.1. All right, next up, we want the ability to delete an item. Okay, and so now we need these IDs, okay? So what we're gonna pass into this delete item function is just the ID of the item that we want to delete, which we will probably get from the user interface. And then based on that ID, we are going to delete the item from our items array. So how are we going to do this? Well, we will use the splice method. So on this.items, we will use the splice method. And now what does the splice method do? Well, basically we pass in a start index and then how many positions we want to take. And it will then return these elements and delete them from the original array. Okay, so it mutates actually the original one. And this one is a bit similar to another one, which is slice. So slice is very similar to splice, with the difference that slice accepts a start and an end index of the portion that we want to take, and then returns a new array. And also it doesn't mutate the original array, okay? So for example, imagine that we have like this array 2, 4, and 8, okay? So let's add a comment here. So if we say splice 1 and then 1, it will start at position number 1 and take one element, so only this 4. And it will then return 4 and mutate the original array. So returns 4, and the original array is 2 and 8. Okay, so that's what happens with the splice. And if we say slice with the same, then it will start on 1 and end on 1. Okay, so it will still return 4, and the original array will be the entire array from the beginning, because we do not mutate the original array. Okay, but the difference here is that this one is the end index, while in Splice, this number here means how many elements we want to take. So if we said 1 and 2 here, well then it would take 4 and 8, returns 4 and 8, and the original array will only be with number 2. And if we had 2 here, well then it will actually return the 4 like we have it here. Okay, because remember the second here is the end, but it's not included. So actually if we had 1, 1, then it would return nothing. Okay, because it would start in 1 and end on number 1, and so it wouldn't return anything. And only when we say 1, 2, so start at position number 1 and end on position number 2, well then it will return the 4, and of course not mutate the original array. Now what we got to do here is to find the index at which we want to splice. So basically what we want is, based on the passed in ID, we want to find the position of the item that matches this ID. All right, so let's start by doing that. So const index, and we will use this dot items dot find index. Okay, and so we already used this one here before, and it's a very handy method for doing this kind of stuff. So we have a callback function which receives the current element, and all we have to do now is to test if the current element dot ID equals the passed in ID. And so it will now find the index of the element which satisfies this condition. So where the element ID is equal to the ID that we passed in. And so with this, we get the index where that exact item is located. And so all we have to do now is to say index and 1, because we only want to remove one element, right? So we start at the position where the item is located and then take out one element. All right, and that's it already, because this mutates the original array, and so it will really it will delete this element from our original items array. Now we also could now return the deleted item. All we had to do would really be return, and so this will now return the deleted item, okay? But we don't want to do that, so all we really want to do is to just delete the item, okay? And so once more, we use the very handy find index method. Now next up, and actually this is already the last one, is that we want to update the count. Okay, so we're not really going to update the entire element, but we will simply allow it to update the count. And so we will pass in the ID of the element that we want to manipulate and also the new count. And let me quickly show it to you in the user interface in the final app. So what I'm trying to do here is this one. So we have these buttons here where we can update the amount of the ingredient, but not the unit, of course, and also not the ingredient itself. So all we can really change here is the count. And so that's why we're having this update count, where we pass in the ID and then the new count that we want to save in the object. And this one is actually even easier to implement than the one before. So let's say this dot items. And so what we want to do now is not to find the index, but to really find the element itself. And so we can do that by using find. So yet another ES6 method, which is a bit similar to find index here, but instead of returning the index, it will return the element itself. And now the rest is really the same as up there. So we want to find the element which has as an element ID the one that we pass in. Okay, and so this will return our item, and then we can say that we want the count of that item to be equal to the new count. And that's it. So with one line of code, we achieved this functionality, which without ES6, so without this function here, would have been a bit more complicated to implement. Okay, so I hope this makes sense here. So this part, which is maybe the most tricky part, but I hope it still made sense to you. So again, what we do here is basically to loop through all the elements in the items and then select the one that has the ID equal to the ID that we passed into the function. Okay, then we return that object and change the count property on it. Okay, and so let's now go into our controller and include this. So import this basically. So recipe, and change them both to list. And now just like before, let's actually create a new element. So a new list element, just to test it out in the console. So const L is a new list. And I will then attach this here to the global window object, such as we did before. Okay, and actually we could simply do it like this. So window.l is simply the new list. And so now we're going to be able to use all of these methods here that we just created. Okay, so let's try that. And now we have these all these console.logs here. So let's get rid of that. Actually, we don't need that. So it's actually the state.recipe, I guess. Probably it's not, but we also don't really need that one. And what we really want here is this state.recipe.ingredients. All right, so let's wait for it. And now we should be able to access L, which is of course an empty array only at this point. So let's use add item here. And remember, what we need to pass in is the, well, I guess it starts with the count. Yeah, so the count, the unit, and the ingredient, and of course the ID will be figured out automatically. So let's say we need to pass in 2 tablespoons of salt, for example. Okay, let's add another one. 2 tomatoes. Oh, and you see it didn't add it to the list really. So let's take a look at that. And yeah, of course. So we simply created the item here, but we still have to push it to the array, right? So that's a stupid mistake, but no problem, of course. So all we have to do is this.items.push the item variable that we just created. Okay, and then it's also a good practice to return the newly created object here. Okay, so return the item. All right, so let's try that again. So 2 tablespoons of salt, and you see it already returns the new object. So it's working now. And you see here, this is the unique ID that was created by the unique package. Okay, so let's add the other one, the 2 tomatoes. And you see it has a different ID, of course. So it's really working. So let's now delete the first one here. And so we need to pass in the ID, remember? So l.delete item. And we need to pass in the ID. Let's take a look at L now. And now we're only left with one array, which should be the one with the 2 tomatoes. So let's take a look at that. And indeed, we have the 2 tomatoes. So great, that's working. Now, just as a last step, let's try to use the update count method. So l.update count. We need to pass in the ID once again. And now we want 10 tomatoes. Okay, take a look again at L. And indeed, we have now 10 tomatoes. Okay, so our API is working. And notice how I said API here, okay? So of course I'm not talking about the API that we use to get the recipes. So API is, again, it's just a term that we can use also for this kind of stuff. So we just basically created an API for creating and updating lists, okay? And so we just tested this API and everything's working correctly. And so in the next video, we're gonna implement the view for the list before creating finally the controller. So let's now build the very simple shopping list view. And as always, we start by creating the new file. Then let's get our elements simply by copying it from here. And okay, so we're only going to have 2 small methods in here. One to render the item and then one to delete the item from the user interface. Okay, so very simple stuff here in this view. So the first one is to render the item. And in order to do that, we will simply receive the item as an input. And the other function will be delete the item. For which we need an ID. So in a similar way to the list model, okay, so based on an ID, we can delete the item. And in order to render it, we need to have the item object itself. So let's start with this one here, create a markup variable such as before. And so let's get that markup here from our HTML file. So where is that? So here we have the UL, which contains the shopping list items. So all of these items are inside the shopping list element. Okay, so let's copy this one. All right, and since we're at it, we can also create this shopping list here in our DOM elements, and it is in the base. So shopping will be document.query selector and then shopping list. All right. So the first thing that we're going to use is the ID. And so just like before, let's add a data attribute here. So data item ID should be equal to item.id. So the one that we passed in here with the list item. Okay, so this is the same way that we did before. So we specified a data attribute here in this view, such like we did here in the search view. Okay, remember that one? So in here somewhere we should have, well, where is that? So yeah, it's here in the button. So here we have this data attribute, which is data goto. So we called goto to this one. So we can later select the elements based on that data attribute and based on that ID in our case. Okay, so this will be useful in order to delete the item. So we have the ID attribute. Let's now include the count, and the count is actually here in the value. Okay, so we have an input field, and that input field has a predefined value, and that value is what we want to specify here. And it will be item.count. Okay, and the same thing goes for the step. So the step is like the change that happens when we hit the arrow buttons on the number field. So let me show that to you here in this example. So we have this list here, and you see that, for example, here we have 0.25. And when we hit the up button, then it will increase by 0.25 to 0.5 and then to 0.25. Okay, and so we can define that step. And if we do the same here, then it will increase not to 1.25, but to 2, 3, and so on and so forth. And here, for example, it will increase to 9, then to 13, and so on and so forth. Okay, so we define that we want the count also to be the step. Of course, if you want to manually change it by hand, we can also write in. Okay, so whenever we click these buttons here, our value gets updated. So next up, we have here the unit. Of course, so item.unit, and then here we have the ingredient. Okay, and finally we also want to add a class here so that we can later select this input, so that we can then read this value here to update it in our model, right? So when we want to do this updating here, we need the new count, and that new count is of course gonna come through this input field. Okay, and so we want to read the value, and so in order to do that, let's add a class here so that we can then easily read it out. So this is going to be called shopping count value. So very simple. Okay, and now all we have to do is to insert this markup to our elements.shopping adjacent HTML, and we will do these here at before end. Okay, so that one is added after the other. Okay, so if we already have 2 items there, then we want the third one to be after the first 2, right? Okay, so that one is now done. Let's move on to the next one. And so let's now actually already use this data item ID property that we have here, because into the delete item function, all we pass in is the ID. And so now we have to select the element that we want to delete based on that ID. So document.query selector. And now we can use the CSS attribute selector, which is simply using these brackets. So we want to select based on data item ID, which should be equal to, and now we need to quote, and then we pass in the ID, and that's it. And so now when we pass in the ID, we will be able to select the exact element, because here we basically attach that ID to our element here, okay? And so the goal was, of course, to be able to do exactly this, okay? And so now, remember how we actually remove stuff from the user interface. We have to move up to the parent so that we can then remove the child. So remove child and then item again, and that's it. So right now we cannot really test this because you don't have our controller yet. I mean, we could, but it's not really necessary. So we're just going to move into the controller right now in the next video, and then we're going to be able to see if all of this works. Okay, so see you there in a second. And to finish this shopping list part of the app, let's now build the controller. So we can close up this file here and go back to our index.js controller file. Okay, so where do we actually want to add the event listener? And we have to do it right here in this event listener that listens to events on the recipe object. Okay, let's take a look at that. So at recipe view, so we already have two event listeners on here, right? So for the plus and the minus buttons, so the button decrease and increase. And so now we need to add an event listener for the button to add all the ingredients to the list. Okay, and that button is down here. So it's this one, the recipe button. And actually we see that we have the recipe, the button also down here. Okay, and so let's add another class to this one here. So let's say recipe button add. And so this will be the class for the button that adds all the ingredients to the list. Okay, so going back to this event listener here, so we already set this one up to handle all the events that happen inside of the recipe object, right? And we need to do it because we need this event delegation, because all of these elements that we're trying to select here, they're not yet on the DOM by the time that we load up the page, right? And so we need to do it this way. So else if, and we're going to do it in the exact same way as before. So we're going to test if the element that was targeted matches the string that we're looking for. Okay, so it's this one here or any of the child elements. So just like before. And so that's the CSS selector for all of the child elements of this element, so the recipe button. Okay, and again, that's because the click might actually not happen right on this button element, but inside of the SVG or even this use element, or also this span element. So it can happen on all of these, but we really want to catch it on this button itself, right? So what do we want to happen when the target matches this button here? Well, we will want to call our control list function. So the function that we're going to create next. And so that's it. So we have a recipe controller, we have the search controller, and now we're also going to have a list controller. Recipe, and I'm going to put this one here. So the list controller. So just like before, let's add the steps that we got to take here in this controller. So first off, create a new list if there is none yet, right? Because imagine that we add the ingredients to a list, then open up another recipe, and then we add those ingredients as well. So in that case, we don't want to create a new list, of course, because we already have one, okay? And we can actually already start implementing this, okay? So if there is not state.list, well, then state.list will be a new list. And that's it. Remember, we don't pass anything into the list because it's empty and we don't need to pass anything in there. We just want to basically initialize and with an empty object. Okay, next up, what are we going to do? Well, what we want to do is to add each ingredient to the list, right? So where are our ingredients? Well, they're at state.recipe.ingredients. And remember that this one is an array. And so let's simply loop over this array, and then for each element in the ingredients, we're going to add a new element to our list. Okay, so it's as simple as that. So for each. So what are we going to do here? We will do state.list, which is the element that we just created up here. And now we can call add item on it, right? So that's the data model that we just defined a few lectures ago, right? So we have our add item method here, to which we add the count, the unit, and the ingredient, okay? And so let's pass all of that data into this function. So we have l.count, we have l.unit, and we have l.ingredient, right? And that's because L is currently one element of the ingredients, and all the ingredients have, of course, a count, a unit, and an ingredient. And now let's take a look again at this function here, or add item function, because it will actually immediately return this item to us. Okay, and so that's great because we can now save that. So let's save it to this variable, and so let's add this item right away to the user interface. And I think we hadn't yet imported. Now that's right. So recipe view, and this one is called the list view. So we have, and where is it? So we have list view dot render item, and then we just pass in the item. So remember, it is, we don't need this one anymore. So we have our render item function here, which receives an item. Okay, so we just pass there, and then it reads all of the data that it needs and basically prints it to the user interface. Okay, so add each ingredient to the list and user interface. And that should actually be it for this step. So let's now finally test it out. And we can actually test it with this here. So add to shopping list. Whoa, and here they are. So it's really working already. That's awesome. So it basically looped through all of these ingredients here and then put each of them here in the list. Okay, and so we already have this loop here. So we have this for each loop here, and that's why we didn't need to include a method here in the list view that loops over all the items. So we did that in the search view, right? So we had render results, and then we looped over all of these results and rendered them one by one. But in this case, that's not necessary because we already have this loop here, and so it's easier to just have this one simple function that will then render them one by one. Okay, so this part is working as of now. And now the next thing is to actually add an event listener to this button here, okay? And also to these, basically to these buttons here, so that we can both delete this entire item and also update the value in our model whenever we change the value like this. So let's implement that. And once again, we are going to need event delegation, right? Because all of these items, they're not yet there by the time that we load the page, right? So let's do that right after here. So handle, delete, and update list item events. So where do we want to catch these events? Well, they are on elements.shopping, right? And so add event listener, click, and we of course need the event. And so, yeah. So first thing that we're gonna have to do is to try and read the ID of the element that we clicked on. Okay, so basically we are trying to retrieve this ID here, okay? So based on the data item ID. And so how are we going to do that? And actually we already used, and it's quite simple. So let's say const ID is e.target, and now we're going to use a method that we used before. Can you guess which method we will need to use here? Well, it's the closest method, okay? And that's because we need to specifically find the element which contains our ID that we want to read. And so we need to specifically find an element with the shopping item class on it close to where the click happened, okay? So closest shopping item is what we're looking for. And then just as before, we can use dataset and then the name that we gave it. So we gave it the item ID, right? So we called it item ID, and that's why we said data-item ID. Okay, so that's how it works with dataset. And just like that, we already have our ID. So wherever we click on the user interface now, and now it's gone really, but wherever we click, no matter if we click here on this text, on this button, on the number, or wherever we want really, it will always go to the closest shopping item and then read the ID from that. Okay, so once again, closest is a really powerful method. It's really, really helpful. Okay, and so next up, we want to handle the delete event. or the delete button really. So we say if e.target.matches, and so this time we're going to use matches because that's going to return a true or false value. So what we're trying to test here is if our target matches the shopping delete class. And once more, let me show that to you. And so it's this here. So shopping delete is the class of this button. And so we will have to test if this is the one that we clicked on, basically. So shopping delete, or again, any of its child elements. Okay, so that's always the same logic. And so if this is the case, we will want to delete it from both the state and the user interface. So very simple, state.list.delete item. And of course we pass in the ID, so the one that we already read here in this previous step. Okay, and then finally list view.delete item as well. And again we pass in the ID, and that's it. Now the test is a bit better. Let's actually make all of this window here, or all of this state here. So let's make all of this state available to us in the global window object for testing purposes. And so now we will be able to see if it actually deleted our items from the state, so from the underlying data as well as from the user interface. Okay, so let's use another recipe which is maybe a bit shorter with not that many ingredients. Now this is better here. So this only has 6. And so here are our 6 ingredients. So let's now click on this and see what happens. Oh, we have an error. And this one is happening in the list view. So let's take a look at that method here. And so it's probably this part here. So probably it didn't correctly select this element that we were looking for. And then so this part here doesn't work correctly. So first of all, let's actually test if there's an item. And so basically we only do this here if there is an item so that it doesn't throw that error. Okay, but now we also have to find out what's going on here. And I can already see the problem, which is that here it's date, where it should be data, of course. So let's try that one again now. Add everything, and now let's delete the salt, and it's gone. And now just to confirm that it's also gone from a state, let's take a look at it. So we have the recipe and the list, of course not the search, because we didn't search for anything. And so let's take a look now at the list. And indeed, we only have 5 elements and the salt is not in there. And so it actually worked. All right. And now only one more thing, which is to update this data here. Okay. So let's now quickly take care of that as well. So back here inside of this event listener, we can simply add a new else if and say e.target.matches. And let's see what we want to match this time. So list view, and it's this class here. So again, this is here the element where our count will be stored and where we can update it using these up and down arrows. So let's take this one. And in this case, we actually don't need to select any of the children because there are none. Okay, so it's just this element. And so what we need to do now is to read the data from the interface and then update it in our state. So let's call it val, standing for value, and our value will be stored in the element that was actually clicked, right? So let's say that we, and now it will be gone, or actually not. So let's say that we clicked this here. And so our target will be this exact element, right? So this input element. And if we click this one here, then the target will be this one. And so what we want to do now is to read the current value of the element that was just clicked. Okay? And what that means is e.target. So e.target is the element that was clicked. And so since this is now an input element, we can read the value property of it, which will then contain the number, so the value that is in there. Okay? So very simple. Now all we have to do is to actually parse it as a float number, because otherwise it's going to be a number, which is not what we want. All right, and now state.list.update the count, and now we have to pass in the ID and the new value. And that's it. And it's not called value, really. Sorry, it's called val. Okay, but now that should be it. So handle the delete button, and now here let's say handle the count update. Okay, now just notice that we're not really listening here for an event where we update this count here, okay? And now it's gone. But anyway, we are not looking for the event where we update this number. We are just looking for the event when we click here, okay? And so, yeah, that's when the event will be triggered. So whenever you click on one of these buttons, then it will change. So let's put olive oil like here to 3. And let's then take a look at state.list. Okay, so we have 6. And let's take a look at olive oil. And here's olive oil. And yeah, it updated to 3. So awesome, it really worked. Now we can delete some of this stuff here. Let's delete all of this. Let's change this one here to -5, which doesn't make much sense, and we could change that. But well, at this point you already know how to do that, and so I'm not going to keep boring you with all this repetitive code. Okay, let's just take a look at this again. And you already see that we only have two elements now, which is -5 instant yeast and then 3 olive oil. So cool, it is working, and so we're done with this part here as well. So next up is then this likes functionality, where we can finally like some recipes and then basically add them to a list of favorites. So that's going to be the last thing that we're going to do. It's going to be a bit more difficult than this list here, but I think it's a great addition because you will learn some new cool stuff. So congratulations for making it this far, and see you in the next video. Hey there, and welcome back. Let's now build the last part of the app, which is the likes, and we're going to start again with building the model. So let me start by showing you the functionality that we're actually trying to implement here. So I'm opening the final app version here. Then let me search for pizza, open up the first result here. And it's not loading because it's the one that's actually already loaded. So the next one. And so down here we have this heart, and now we want to be able to actually click the heart. It then becomes selected, and it's added here to the list. Okay, and if we move down to the next one, then we can like this one as well, and now we have both on the list. And if we come back to the first one, then the like should still be there, and indeed it is. And then we can add some more, and the list then keeps growing and growing, adding all of our elements. Okay. If we then go back to this one, we can unlike, of course, and then it moves it out here of the list, and it's no longer there, of course. So that's what we're trying to implement here, and let's start again with the model. So I'm going to call this one here likes.js. And now this one will actually be a bit similar to the list class. Okay, so we will have a list again, and in this list, instead of saving the ingredients as before, we are going to save the likes. So export default class and likes, or constructor, and again we don't pass anything into it, but we initialize it with a empty array, which is going to be stored in this.likes. Okay, and so again this is a bit similar to the list class, and so we could do the subclassing here. So just like I showed you in the ES6 section, where we can add subclasses to classes. But in this case I think it doesn't really make sense, because first, they're actually not that similar, and also they are semantically quite different. So a shopping list and a list of likes is quite a different thing. So it's not like, for example, a pizza recipe, which is still a subclass of recipe. So they are like related things. But the list of likes and list of ingredients, well, they're kind of a different thing. Okay. Now, nonetheless, let's add the add like method here. And so again, this is a bit similar to the list that we coded up before. Now this time we are going to pass in the ID, the title of the recipe, the author, and the image. Okay, and so that is the data that we need in order to display it like this. So when we want it here in the list, we need the author, the image, the title of the recipe, of course, and then the ID, so that we can then open it up like this. So we need always to have this ID so that we can call this URL. Okay, and so that's the data that we need to save here in each individual like. So ID, title, author, and image. So let's create a like object, and it's an object that will contain simply all of these elements. So ID, title, author, and the image, and we will then push it to the likes array. So this dot likes dot push the new like. Okay, and then just like before, we are also going to return the newly created like. Okay, and now we have to delete like also, which needs as an input the ID. And so this one is actually quite the same as before. So let's actually go ahead and save us some time here. Go to the list, copy all of this here, then get rid of this here. And so all we have to change really here is change it from items to likes. Okay, and then it's going to work in the exact same way. So we pass in an ID, then we find the index of that ID, and then remove the element corresponding to that ID from the likes array using the splice method. Okay, so that's exactly the same as before. Now we also need another method here, which is the isLiked. Okay, and again we're passing in an ID, and this method here is basically to test if we have a like in our array here which has the ID that we pass in. And this one is going to be important for this functionality here. So where we want to display this button here as either liked or not liked. So we have to know when we load a recipe if it's a liked recipe or if it's not, in order to then accordingly style this button. But you're going to see why a bit better when we start coding the controller and the view. So how can we do this? Well, we just need to try to find the index of the ID. So in a very similar way to up here again, and then see if it is different to -1. Because if the index is -1, it means that it is not there. So what we're going to return is this.likes.findIndex, and then find the index, of course, where the past ID is equal to the current ID in the current loop. Okay, and we will then test if this is different than -1. Okay, and that's because if we cannot find any item with the ID that we passed in, then this will be -1. Okay, and if this is -1, well, then this entire expression here will turn out to be false, which is what we want, because it means that the recipe with the ID that was passed in is not liked. Now, on the other hand, if this turns out a number that is not -1, well, then this here will, of course, be true, and we will then return true, because the recipe with the ID that we passed in is, of course, liked. So it is basically here in this array. All right. So that's the isLiked method. And now we also need a very simple method called get the number of likes. Okay, so this one just returns this.likes.length. And okay, so this should be enough for the model. For now, we will add some more stuff a bit later, but for now it works fine just like this. And I think we don't really have to test this here now in the console, because it's so similar to the list model, which is already working, and so the likes should be working as well. And if not, well, we're going to find the error then in a second in the next video, when we will start coding up the controller for this likes. Let's quickly continue and build now the controller for the likes feature of our app. So this is where we left off with our model. Let's put it this way here and start working on the controller again. Okay, so let's get this code here inside the like controller. Now, where do we actually trigger a new like? Well, it happens, of course, on that like button, right? And that like button is again in the recipe, and so we will control that click again in this event listener here, okay? So all events that happens on the recipe, we will all of them handle here in this event handler. So you're already handling the decrease button, the increase button, and also the add to list button. So we didn't write it down here, let's actually do that. All right, so let's grab the name for the selector. So it is in recipe view, and the like is this button. So it's the recipe love class that is associated with the button. Okay, and so that's the one that we want to test for now. So else if the target matches this selector or any child element, just like before. Okay, because I think there are some childs, and yeah, of course. So this SVG here might also be where the click happens, and in that case, we want to still match the button itself. Okay, and what is going to happen in this case? Well, we want to call the like controller, which we don't have yet, but we will do it in a second. So it is simply the controller control like. Okay. So again, just like before, let's start by creating a new likes object. Okay. And again, we will only create it if it's not yet there. So if we have state.likes, or actually if we don't have state.likes, then we say that state.likes is a new likes object. And now we need to think about two different states that can happen. So let's say that we have a recipe that is already liked. So in this case, if we hit the button, then we want to remove this recipe from the list of liked recipes. And so we want to change the underlying data model. We want to change this button here like this. And we also want it get removed from here. But if it's the other way around, so if we didn't yet like it, well, then we want it to be added. And we want it to be added here also in the user interface. Okay, so we have two different situations. And so now we are going to need that method that we coded up before, which is to test if a certain recipe is already liked or not. So let's start with what happens when it's not liked. So state.likes.isLiked. And now we need to pass in the current ID, which is, and let's actually put it out here. So current ID is state.recipe.id, right? So let's say current ID. And then we're also going to have an else statement. So in the case that the current recipe was already liked. But usually when we encounter a new recipe, it will usually not have been liked yet. And so we're starting with that one here. Okay. So let's actually say that here. User has not yet liked current recipe. This one like this. Okay. And then down here, let's copy this. So I always like to keep my code commented. User has liked the current recipe. All right. So we then want to add the like to the data. So to the state, let's say, we want to basically toggle the like button. So in this case, where it has not been liked, it will then become the full heart. And in the other case down here, it will then become the empty heart, basically. Okay, so toggle the button and then add like to the UI list. And if it's the other way around, well, then we're going to do the other thing. So remove like from the state, toggle the like button still, and also remove it from the UI. Remove like from UI list. So let's start by creating a new like here. And that is done by saying state.likes. So what we created just up here. So state.likes.addLike. And so what do we need to pass in here? And let me actually do it in separate lines. So the likes, we need to pass in the ID, the title, the author, and the image. Okay, so the ID is the current ID. Then we have state.recipe.title. And we have the author, and of course the image. Okay, so we created our new like here. Then we toggle the like button, and we cannot do that yet because we don't have the view functions just yet. And then add it to the UI, which we also still don't have, but that's simply console.log it. So state.likes. Okay, and the same thing here in the other case. So instead of removing it from the UI, for now, let's just log it to the console. And so here we add it into the likes, and here we want to remove it from the likes. So all we have to do is to say state.likes and delete the like. And we pass in the current ID. And that should be it. Okay, so that's what we defined right here in our likes model. So we hooked it up down here also. Yeah, so we have control like, and so we can now actually test it out already. So let's search for pizza here. And hit the like button. And we have an error. Okay, so likes is not defined. And yeah, of course, so this likes here is not defined. And that's because we didn't include the model just yet. All right, so now we should be ready to roll. Oh, we have our likes array already here. And indeed, it is the best pizza dough ever. So it's working, you see? It has this current ID also here. And so great, it's working. Well, it's not really here yet. And so let's now try it out with another one. And yeah, now we have both. And it's also working. And if we now go back to this one here, well, now I will hit this button here again and see if it's then deleted. And indeed, it's gone. So it's working. So now we only have the deep dish fruit pizza, so the next one. And if I now also dislike this one here, well, then it's gone. So all our likes are now gone, which means that our controller is currently working. Okay, so next up, all we have to do now is to create the view. So toggle this button here, and then also display the list of likes up here. And in this video, we're going to handle the user interface for the likes. So let's create a likes view. Okay, then get this part here. So our elements, close it up. And now the first thing that we're going to do is to create a function to toggle the like button. So we say export const toggle the like button. Okay, and in here we will pass the isLiked variable, so a boolean saying true or false whether the current recipe is liked or not, and we will then adjust the button accordingly. So basically what we want to do here is, so in the recipe view, where do we have the icon? It's yeah, it's actually right here. So we want to change basically this icon here, so we can have the icon heart outlined or just icon heart. Okay, so outlined is when it's not liked, and without the outline, so just icon heart is when it is liked actually. So let's just copy this part here so that we know how this is written actually. And so let's create a variable for this name here, okay, according to the isLiked variable. So const icon string. And so we're using the ternary operator here and say if it's liked, then it should be icon heart. And if not, then it's icon heart outline. Okay, and now we can actually select that button. So let's take a look at the class name. And so it's recipe love. And what we need to change is on the use element. So recipe class, and then the use element is a child of that. So we're selecting this one, and now all we need to do is to change the href attribute here. So this one. So how do we do that in JavaScript? And I'm not sure if we have done this before. And so all we have to do is to say dot set attribute, and then we say the attribute that we want to change, which is the href one, and then what we want to set it to. And we want to set it to, let's take a look. So to this, well, actually to this here, and then we will add the string that we just created. So img/icons.svg and then our icon string. Okay, makes sense? So we're selecting the element where the icon is located. So it's this use element, parent of recipe love. And then we set the href attribute using this method here to our icons.svg and then with the icon name according to is liked. All right, so let's test that actually in index.js. And yeah, here it is. Okay, and actually before we can do that, we need to, of course, import this list view, and it's not list, it is likes. So likes view. So likes view dot total like button, and now in here we pass true. Okay, so this is the case where the user has not yet liked the current recipe, and so after he likes it, then of course it should be liked, and so it's true here. Right? And then the next one is the opposite, and it will be false. Okay, so that part should now be working. And actually we can test it here, and it's working. Well, kind of at least. It seems like one of the strings is not correct. So where do we have that? So it's icon heart and icon heart outline, and should be outlined like this. All right, so yeah, now it's working. Okay, so cool. Now what's not working is that when we come to this page here, it will not be toggled. So let's say we like this pizza now. Then we choose another one. And when we then come back, well, then it will no longer be with the liked icon here, okay? So if we now click, then it's unliked, now it's liked again. But it should be liked right from the beginning, okay? And so we need to implement that, and that will be in the recipe view, okay? So when the recipe is loaded, then we already need to know if this recipe is liked, and then display this button here accordingly. Okay, so let's open up our recipe view, and then in here we need to not only pass the recipe, but also if it's liked. So is liked. And then we come down here to the icon, and we can then just change this here, put in a variable, and use the ternary operator. So is liked, and if it is liked, well, then don't add anything here. And if it's not liked, well, then add the outlined. So this is a bit similar to what we just did in the other function. So if it is liked, then it will just be icon heart, and if it's not liked, then the dash outlined will be added. All right, and then finally, of course, we also need to pass in the is liked when we render the recipe. So index and is liked, and where? Here it is. So we have state recipe, and let's now separate it into a different line. And we also need to pass in state.likes.isLiked, and then the current ID. And we have that available to us here in this function. So here is the ID actually. Okay, so the current recipe ID. And so here we test if it is liked. Okay, and so here this will then return true or false, which is what we passed in to into this render function. So not this one. Whoa, what's happening here? Well, anyway, so we pass it into this render recipe saying if it's liked or not. All right, so let's test it out now. And it says error processing recipe for some reason. Okay, so it means that it happens somewhere here. So let's actually also log the error to the console. Okay, so I'm not sure what's happening here because maybe something is wrong with this here, but I'm not really sure what it could be. So let's try to load this again. And so now we can see the actual error. Cannot read property is liked of undefined. So let's take a look at that. It is at control recipe. And so the problem is it's right here. Okay, so it cannot read this state.likes.isLiked because whenever we reload the page, we don't yet have a state.likes. Okay, and so therefore we cannot really read then this method. Okay, Now in the next video, we will make this like data persistent. So basically we will save it in the browser, and when we reload the page, it will still be there, and then it will no longer be a problem. But for now, a good way of fixing this is to simply out of everything, so here in the global scope, we can simply add a new like to the state whenever we load the page. Okay, so just for testing here, so that we remove it later on. All right, so let's test it out again now. And yeah, so now it's working. So let's search for pizza. And so we liked it, we can dislike it, and that still works. Let's like it again. And now let's try coming to the next one, like it as well. Come to another one, and then come back to this one. And you see, it is still liked. So great. And this one here should also still be liked. Now we can unlike it, come back to this one, unlike it as well, come back to this, and it's still unliked, just as we put it before. So that functionality is now actually working. Next up, let's add a small function that will ensure that this heart here, so this entire menu here, is only displayed when there's actually a like. And if there's no like, then this entire button here, like this heart icon, should disappear. All right. So back into the likes view, let's say export const toggle like menu. And we can pass in the number of likes here. And based on that, we're going to figure out if we should show or not the like menu. So first off, we can actually add that element to our base.js. So let's take a look at the HTML. And it is right at the top. So what we're looking for is this. So this likes list here, or actually this field here. Okay, so this here is the icon, and so that's the one that we want to show or hide, depending. So base.js, let's add a new one here, and I'm going to call it the likes menu. Remember, likes menu. So all we have to do is to say elements.like menu, and now we can manipulate the style property. Okay, so in order to just manipulate a single style in CSS, and what we're looking for is the visibility. Now, as you already know, if we had many styles that we wanted to apply, well, then we would just define a class in CSS and then toggle that class here using JavaScript. But in this case, it's just the simple visibility property. And so let's just do it like this with the style property here. Okay, so we can now do a ternary operator and say that if numLikes is greater than 0, well, then it should be visible. And if not, so basically if it is 0, well, then we want it to be hidden. And that's it. That's really all it takes here in this case. All right, so it's the toggle like menu. So index.js, coming back, and yeah, actually it's right here. And so this should also happen in the control like, and it doesn't really matter if the user has already liked it or not. And so we can just add it here after all of this. So list view dot toggle the like, and it is not button, it's the menu. All right, and then in here we pass the number of likes, which remember we did a method for that actually. So get number of likes. So state dot likes dot get number of likes. So let's test this one out again, and we have a warning here. So thank you Webpack for actually telling us that toggle like menu is not in the list view. And yeah, of course not. It's likes. It's the likes view, obviously. So let's again search for pizza. Open this one here up. Well, actually, it's already opened. So the next one, and now we have 1 like, and so if it's here, of course, and now we should have 0 likes, and now it's gone. Now when we loaded the page, it was actually also there. So let's add the same outside here. And again, this is just for testing because we are going to change this in the next lecture when we're gonna persist this likes data, okay? But anyway, for now, let's just put it outside here so that when we reload it now, well, then it's really gone. Okay, and as the last step, we will now finally actually render our likes into that menu. Okay, so just like this. So this is again very similar to the way we did it before. So render the like, and we're going to pass in the like, and then create our markup variable just like usually. Now we need to get up that markup from the HTML. So for each like, we will have this list item, and yeah, it's here. And now what do we need to put here? Well, here it's of course the ID, so like.id, and so let's grab this and copy it. Here we have the image. Here we have the title as the alternative text. Here also the title. And finally here the author. Okay, and then finally we need to insert the HTML. And so first off, let's add this here to our elements. So the likes list. So likes list, document.query selector. So likes list, and so elements dot likes list dot insert adjacent HTML, and again before end, and our markup. And since we're added here, well, we don't need to test it yet. Let's first add the delete like function as well. So export delete the like. And for that, we need the ID as usual. So let's select the element. So document.query selector. And then we will do our special CSS selector where we can select based on the href attribute. And we did this one here before in the in the search view, I believe. So yeah, so it's down here. So we select it based on the ID. And so let's actually go ahead and copy it because it's the exact same thing. Okay, so we want to select all of the anchors, so all of the links which have the href with this ID. All right, and actually this is not quite correct because we don't want to select all of the links. We just want to select the links that are actually a like. Okay, so we want to select not the links, but the ones with the likes link class. So likes link, and then the ones that have this ID. Okay, and the same actually applies to the search view here. So we don't want to select all of the links because then that might select the link in the likes list and not the one in the search result. And so that is here a small bug. And so instead, let's simply select the result link. So it's this results link. Okay, so that's the one that we need to actually select. All right. Now this selects the link, but we don't want to just remove the link. We want to remove the entire li element, right? So we're selecting this link element, but what we want to delete really is this entire list element, okay? And that's very simple. We just select the parent. So parent element. So very simple. And if there is an element, so it's always best to test if the selection here was actually successful. So if there is an element, well, then we can remove it. And just like before, we move up to the parent element and remove the child. Okay, so now it's time to actually test this. And so this is our version, pizza, and so let's try it with the pizza quesadillas. No error, and it's here. but it's not really in the list. So something went wrong here. Well, this functionality here still works and the button is still gone, but something in the code is not correct. And it didn't even give us an error. So maybe it's just something with the render like. And yeah, I guess the problem is that we didn't really already call these functions. Yeah, so we just logged it to the console. And so of course we need to do likes view dot render the like and pass in the new like. Okay, and so that's why we saved it here also to this variable. Okay, so we did the add like, which then, remember, returns the newly added like. So we can save it here into this variable and then pass it to the likes view module. All right, so we have the render like here, and then also, well, let's get rid of this console.log here actually, and here as well. We already know that it works. And so all we have to do now is likes view dot delete like, and what we need to pass in now is the ID. So current ID that we have up here. Okay, and so now we should be good to go. So let's like this one. The heart appeared, and here we go. So we have pizza quesadillas. Now we have to also like shorten the title here, right? So just like it appears here. And we already have a function for that, right? So it's right here in the search view, right? It is the, where is it? Yeah, so it's the limit recipe title. Okay, and so now we want to actually use it here in our likes view as well. So first we have to export it. And so let's now actually import this entire module into our likes view module. Or actually not all of it. So all we really want is the, and I have to go back to copy it. So all we want is just this function from the search view. Okay, and so here we have title, and so it's actually not this one, it's here, the one in H4. And so let's now say limit the recipe title, and let's see if that works. So pizza, let me like this one here already, and yeah, so now it's better. Let's now like this one as well, and indeed, here we go. And so I can now click this and it takes me to that recipe. And at the same time, it also actually highlights it here. So everything's working perfect. Our icon is also still liked. If we take a look at this one, then this is not liked, but we can add it. And you can see that it now is added, of course, also to this one. Now let's open one of these and let's unlike it and see what happens. And it's gone. So it's working. Our functionality is now fully implemented. And it works just fine. So let's delete all of them and take a look if the button actually disappears. And indeed it does. Okay, let's add it back. And here we go. And if we now reload this, well, then it's gone. So it's no longer liked. And so what we're going to do in the next video is to actually persist this data. So basically save it in the browser. And when we then reload the page, all our likes will still be there. So that's then a bit like more useful for the user if we were to use it like on our local computer. Okay, so great work, great job making it all the way until this point. There's just a tiny bit missing, which is this functionality that I just talked about that we're going to implement right in the next video. So now that the recipe liking functionality is 100% working, let's take it to the next level by persisting the likes data, so that liked recipes are kept even after we reload the page. And we're going to do that using the local storage API. So that's something completely new and really exciting, I think. And so let's get started with it. So basically, the web storage API allows us to very simply save key value pairs right in the browser. And this data will actually stay intact even after page loads. Okay, so it really stores this data right here in the browser. And before actually implementing it into the app, I want to first start testing it here in the console, okay? Just to show you how simple it actually is to use local storage. So all we have to do is to say local storage, which is basically a function that lives on the window object, on the global object, and so it's available to us everywhere. So all we have to do is say local storage dot set item. And I should have used the tab, of course, and not the return. So set item. And then, as I mentioned, what we're going to save here is a key value pair. So similar to what we do in objects. So we can specify a key, let's say ID, for example. And this is always a string, and then a value. And also the value always has to be a string. Okay, so we cannot really save JavaScript objects or arrays or something like that in here. Well, we actually can, and we're going to see how in a second, but they still have to be always strings. So let's put some string here, it doesn't really matter. And so now we set this item into our local storage. Okay, and that's actually it. Now if we want to retrieve it, we can simply use local storage dot get item, and then we just have to pass in the key, and it gets back our data. Okay, so that's really simple, and that's actually all we have to do in order to use local storage. Let's add something more. Local storage dot set item, let's say like recipe, and something like tomato pasta. What we can also do is to simply say local storage, and then it will show us what we have in our storage. So we right now have the ID that we defined and our recipe. And then coming from Webpack, we also have this weird thing here. Okay, so Webpack also uses actually the local storage to save some data into there. And then we always have access to the length property. Okay, so we can always say local storage dot length, and in this case it will then return 3. Now what is so special about local storage, as I mentioned, is that the data persists throughout page loads. So let's actually reload the page. And so let's open local storage again, and our data is still there. So we have the ID and the recipe still here. Now we can set items, we can get them back, and we can also remove them. And very simple as well. So remove item, pass in the key, and that's it. Let's take a look at the local storage again, and you see that now it's gone. Okay, so as you see, the local storage API is very simple. We just have set item, get item, and remove item, and also the length property. Okay, so that's really all you need to know in order to use local storage. All right, so let's now go ahead and implement it in our app. Okay, and we start by opening up our model. Okay, so this is it, because this is where we actually want to implement the local storage. Now, how are we going to do this? Well, I think the easiest way to do it is to each time that we change our likes array here is to then persist that data, so to basically store that data into the local storage. And so that's whenever we add a like and when we delete a like. So when we change the like array, then at that exact moment, we should save it into the local storage. Okay, so let's just add a comment here quickly. Persist the data in local storage, and then the same thing here in the delete like method. Okay, and so this is the same thing here. We will do this in both methods, and so let's add a new method that we can then call from both add like and delete like. Okay, so let's call this one here persist data. Here with the camel case notation, and okay, so it's very simple. We just say set item, and we're going to call it likes. And then what we want to save here is the entire this.likes array, basically. Now remember that in here we can only save strings. So we have to convert that array into a string. So we can say json.stringify, and then this.likes. And this will basically transform it into a string here, which then later when we read the storage, we can convert it back to an array. Okay, and that's actually it. So that's all we have to do to persist our data, and now of course call it from these two methods. So persist data. Yeah, so I forgot the this. So it's a method on this exact object, and so we have to say, of course, this dot persist data. Okay, and let's actually test it out now. So we reload the page, and then let's now like this recipe, and now local storage, and whoa, here we actually already have all likes. So it's already stored in the local storage, and you see that it actually did convert the array into a string, and all of the objects that are inside it, well, right now it's just only one, but it still also converted all of that just into strings. Okay, and if you now go ahead and add more, let's take a look. So we have the sweet potato, and let's do it just with this first one. So we liked it, and now into the local storage here, yeah, we see that we now have both of them in here in this string. Okay, so it's important to know that it's all in the same likes key. Okay, so we only have one key which is for the likes, and then all of the likes will be stored in that single one. All right. Now next up, we actually need a method to read the data back from the local storage when we load a page, right? So imagine the scenario that we're reloading a page, and we then want to have access to all our liked recipes so that we can then put them here into this list, right? Because if we reload it now, then the data will of course stay in a local storage, but it will be gone here from our list, okay? And so we have to add them back into the list here, of course. So first off, we need a method to retrieve these likes from the local storage, okay? And so let's add that to the likes model, okay? So read storage. And so let's first save it into a variable. And so all we have to say is local storage.getItem, remember, and then the name of the key, which is likes. Now remember that this here will be a string, okay? And so we have to convert it back into the JavaScript array, like we said before. So we have JSON stringify to turn it into a string, and then we have the opposite, which also lives on a JSON object, so JSON.parse. Okay, and so this will convert everything back to the structures, to the data structures that it was before. Now, if there's nothing in the local storage for this likes here, so if we did never store any like, then this here will return null. Okay, so this local storage.getItem, when it doesn't have the key that we're looking for, it will return null. And so we have to now test for this. So if there is a storage, so basically if it's not null, well, then we simply want to say that this.likes should be the likes that we just read out of the storage. Okay, and so in this line here, we are basically restoring our likes from the storage. Let's write that down here because I think it's important to remember. So restore from the local storage. Okay, so this one here is important to store the result of what we read from the local storage back into this.likes. All right, so let's now go back to our browser and test it out. Okay, and you see that we have access to, of course, the local storage first of all, where we have our likes, and we also have access to the state through the window object. Okay, remember that we attached it to the window object for our testing purposes. And so right now we have this likes object in here, but it is still empty. And so let's now call the read storage method that we just coded. So state.likes.read storage. Okay, and now let's check it out again. And so now we should have the data in the likes. And indeed, here they are. So they are back to being objects, and so everything is working perfect. So remember, we reloaded the page, and of course the likes were gone from the likes object, but they were still in the local storage. And we then called the read storage method that we coded up before in order to restore these likes back into the likes object that we have here in our global state. Okay, and so you can see that they are now here back in the object. All right, and so now all we have to do is to do exactly this here automatically in a controller, of course. Okay, so this here is done. Let's go back to the controller and add a new event handler for when the page loads. Okay, so what we just did in the console is what we want to do each time that the page loads. So restore liked recipes on page load. So window.event listener when the page loads. And so each time the page loads, we want to start by creating the new likes object. So basically what we did up here, we need to now do it inside of that event handler. And so this was just for testing, remember, and so now we're getting rid of it. So we start by creating the new likes object, which will of course be empty after a page reload. Okay, but now we can then fill it just like we did in the console a minute ago. And so we just say read storage, and with that all likes are back. Okay, so let's add some comments here again. Then we also want to toggle the button. Okay, so just like we did up here also, so that in case if there are some likes, then the button is actually displayed. And then finally, of course, we want to render all liked recipes up there in the menu, right? So render the existing likes. So state.likes and .likes again, right? Because that's the way that we called the likes array. And so now we call for each. And so for each like, what we want to do is to say just like we did before, so likes view, and then pass in the like. And that's it. So this is the code for restoring our likes from local storage. Okay, and well, actually it's not the right code. So this is of course it's likes view dot render like. Okay, so now it's correct. So maybe you have spotted that already. Well, I did not. So anyway, this should now be working. Let's test it out. And you see our list is up here, and both the recipes we had liked before are now there. So the best pizza dough ever. Let's now unlike it. It's gone here. Let's reload the page. And you see it's still gone. So that's just perfect. Let's try it with a couple others. So let's try the deep dish fruit. It's like this one, and the cauliflower. This one looks great as well. So let's like it. And of course, they're all there. If we go back to it, the like will still be displayed. And now when I reload the page, they're all still there. And the recipe is still liked here with the, as you can see in the button, and it's also liked here. Okay, so that's it. It's working now. That's the end of our project. We have implemented all the functionalities that I wanted to show you, and I believe and hope for sure that you learned a lot along the way. So in the next lecture, we will just have some final considerations and then really wrap up this project. So see you there in a second. Welcome to the last video in this section. So let's wrap up our project with some final stuff that we need to take care of. And the first thing is that I spotted a bug that sometimes happens when we update the servings. And not in all recipes, but let's look at one specifically, which is this one. And actually it's already open, okay. So first we have this weird huge number here, okay, and so that doesn't look so good. And if we now increase this here, then you see that at some point it doesn't actually do anything, but instead it gives us this error here. And this error has to do with these two long numbers and with some rounding issues. And so we will have to go back and fix that. And so what's responsible for displaying these numbers here is a function that we coded up a long time ago, which is the format count. And that is in the recipe view. Okay, so here we have the format count. And so sometimes, again, we have numbers like, well, something like 0.333 and so on and so forth. And the fraction function here apparently cannot really deal with that. And so the solution is to simply round the number that comes in. Okay, so let's simply create a variable here called the new count and then round it to like 4 decimal places. Now, for some weird reason, the math.round only returns integers, okay? But there's a workaround for that. So if we were to pass in just count, then we would entirely lose the decimal part. But instead, we can multiply this by 10,000 in this case, because we want 4 decimal places, and then divide the result by 10,000 again. Okay, and so with that, we can still use math round in order to have the 4 decimal places that we want. And if we want 5, well, then we can simply add another 0 here and 1 here, but that's not really necessary in this case. Okay, and so now everywhere we used count, we will simply use the new count. Okay, so let's test it out, and it looks a bit better already. So it's still not perfect, but for now I am going to leave it like this. Okay, so it does work actually. But anyway, what matters now is that we no longer have this error here when we reach the number 6, so 6 servings. So the error is gone, and now everything works just as intended. So let's move down, and yeah, so everything works now. Next up, let's clean up a bit our code. And by that I mean just the index.js. So we have some stuff here that we don't want in the production version. So for example, we don't want to leak all of our state data into the global object. And so let's take out that one. Let's see if we have some more. So we have some console.log here of the ID. That one we also don't need. Give it some more space here. And let's see. Yeah, so down here we have another thing, so another variable that we added to the global object, which we don't need at all. Okay, so now I think it's a bit better, a bit cleaner code. Now, next up, let's actually start up our build process. So this one here, where we use Webpack in the production mode. Okay, so let's move to our terminal, and right now we can actually quit this task. Okay, so we no longer want our development version running here because we're finished with developing. Okay, and so if you reload this now, you will see that the site can be reached because, of course, our connection is lost because the web development server is no longer working. Okay, but anyway, what we want to do now is npm run build. That will then bundle up all our files, create a small reduced bundle, and actually write it to disk as well. So we end up with a bundle size of 125 kilobytes, which is actually not really small, and an index.html of 17.6. Okay, and there are methods for shrinking this down here, and it will probably be possible to do this, but that's a bit too much for this course. For that you can take like a more in-depth Webpack course. Okay, so what matters here for us is that actually the bundle is now written to disk, and we see that our code is this beautiful piece of code. All right, so that's minified, compressed, and yeah, so that's the result of Webpack. We cannot figure out what the hell all of this is, but it also doesn't really matter if you're just interested in making this work. Okay, so I guess we're finished with this project. Of course, we could make it a little bit better, and so let's take a look at a couple of suggestions of stuff that you could improve here. So if you want to have some more fun with this project, then the first thing that you can do is to implement a button to delete all the items in our shopping list at the same time. So right now we can only delete them one by one, but you could put a button to basically clear the entire list all at once. Then second, you could also implement a functionality to manually add items to the shopping list. So having like an input field with a small button so we can add more stuff to our shopping list besides the ingredients of the recipes. And also you could then store all of this data in local storage like we did with the likes. Okay, so that would make it a bit better again. Now, another small thing that you could change is the ingredient parsing algorithm. Okay, so that part that I showed you, like for example in that recipe that we just saw with this huge number that looks a bit difficult to understand. So you could improve that and some other edge cases that do not really work with the current way the algorithm is done. Okay, so I didn't want to make that video even longer than it already was, but you sure can improve on it. Okay, then next up, you can come up with an algorithm for more precisely calculating the amount of servings. So right now we simply added 4 servings to each of the recipes, but maybe with some research and analyzing the data, you can try to understand how many servings we have based on the amount of ingredients. Okay, so that could be a fun algorithm to code up. Okay, and now finally, you could improve the error handling. So instead of having these alert windows popping up when there's an error, you could like display this somewhere on the user interface. Okay, so these are just a couple of suggestions that you have, and I'm sure that you can improve the project even more than this. And if you do, then please make sure to share it on the Q&A in the course. Okay, so I would be really excited to see that. And all right, so that's really it. I hope you had as much fun with this project as I did, that you learned a ton of new stuff along the way, and that it will ultimately make you a bit better at coding JavaScript. So thanks for making it this far in the course, and see you next time. Congratulations on finishing the course. So after going through all the videos and coding the project and the challenges, I hope that right now you're super confident to write code completely on your own, and that you're ready to also continue your learning journey. Because a course like the one that you just finished, well, can only take you so far. It can give you an amazing foundation and a lot of knowledge, but in the end, you really need to practice on your own. Build your own apps, improve your websites, come up with new projects to code, and improve yourself every single day. Never stop learning. And that is especially true in JavaScript and front-end web development, because things change very fast. And so this is a field where you have to be always learning and always be on top of everything that's happening in the industry. And I really know how hard that can be. And so in order to help you keep updated, I actually started a monthly newsletter last year. And my subscribers really appreciated that, because it's been super helpful for them ever since. So if you want to check it out, you can just subscribe to the newsletter over at jonas.io. Now, once you feel confident enough with your new skills, you can also start learning popular libraries or frameworks like jQuery, React, Angular, or Node.js. And all of these technologies will enable you to build even cooler apps, and at the same time make you even more qualified to apply to real jobs in the industry. So if you really spend some more time learning and getting better and better at JavaScript and maybe some other technologies, then I'm 100% confident that you can start working in a field if that's your goal. I've seen students from this course and my other courses getting real jobs and starting real careers. And so I'm absolutely sure that you can achieve the exact same thing. So to finish, it was really nice having you in this course and taking this really amazing journey with you. And now I wish you good luck with your new skills. Take care and see you next time. Hey there, how are you doing today? So I hope that you've been learning JavaScript like crazy and finished this course with a deep understanding of how the language works and everything we can do with it in the browser. Now, maybe you're aware of the fact that we can actually also use JavaScript outside of the browser. And the most popular way of doing so is by using a technology called Node.js, which we can use to create web servers and build the backends of our web applications. So in this bonus section, I want to give you a very brief crash course into Node.js by building a simple project using this modern and quite popular technology. Because in fact, we will still be using JavaScript. And so I thought it made perfect sense to include this topic as a bonus to the complete JavaScript course. So this is a small project that we're going to build with the terrible name, the laptop store. Okay, and so we have these 5 laptops here, and this page is actually completely generated on a Node.js web server. Okay, so when we click this button here, notice how the URL changes from product to laptop with the ID of 0. And so this laptop here has the ID 0. We can go back, and then Node.js again generates this page here. Then when we check out the second one, this one has the ID number 1. And as you can guess, this one will have the ID number 2, 3, and 4. Okay, so again, all of these are automatically generated by Node.js. And so that is exactly what we're going to build throughout this small crash course. So I hope that sounds and looks super exciting to you. And so let's now dive right in and start by getting a quick idea of what Node.js actually is. So the official definition is that Node.js is a JavaScript runtime built on the V8 JavaScript engine. Now that sounds a bit crazy, so what does it actually mean? Well, let's start by trying to understand what a JavaScript runtime and the V8 engine are. So as I mentioned in the beginning, if you have used JavaScript before, it was probably always just inside a browser, right? Because any browser natively understands HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And no matter if you write vanilla JavaScript or React or Angular, that's all just JavaScript that gets executed right in the browser. So in this case, the browser is a JavaScript runtime. But what if we could take JavaScript out of the browser and simply execute our code somewhere else, without all the restrictions that we have in the browser? Well, it turns out that we actually can, and the solution for this, as you can guess by now, is called Node.js. And so Node.js is just another JavaScript runtime. It's just like a container, like an environment in which a program written in JavaScript can be executed, but outside of any browser whatsoever. Alright? It's actually a bit more complex than that, of course, but for now this is enough. Now, who actually does execute the code if not the browser? And that's where the V8 engine developed by Google comes into play, because that is exactly where JavaScript code will be parsed and run in Node.js. Okay? So I hope that the definition of Node.js being a JavaScript runtime built on the V8 engine makes a lot more sense to you now. And again, remember that this is just a very high-level overview of what Node is and how it works. But in this small crash course, all I want is to really just give you a quick idea of what Node is and what amazing things we can do with it. Anyway, now that we have JavaScript outside of the browser in a kind of standalone environment, which is Node.js, we can do so much more things with JavaScript that were completely impossible before, like accessing the file system or better networking capabilities are now possible with Node.js. And all these factors together give us the perfect conditions for using Node.js as a web server, meaning that now we can finally use JavaScript on the server side of web development in order to build fast, highly scalable network applications for powering the back end of our websites or applications. Okay, and so let's do exactly that in the next video, where we're going to start building that project that I showed you. So I hope you're excited for that, and see you in a second. Okay, so let's now start building the laptop store using Node.js. And the first thing that you need to do is to actually go ahead and download Node.js for your computer. So just head over to nodejs.org and then download probably version 10 here. Okay, so that's the most stable version right now. And if you don't find the download for your operating system here, you can just go here to downloads and it's going to be there for sure. And if you already have Node installed on your computer, please just make sure that it's at least version 8 or better 10. Okay? And to quickly determine the version you're on, you just need to head over to the terminal and type node-v. Okay, and so it gives me 10.11, and so I'm at least on version number 10. Then after doing that, just download the starter files for this project, as usual from the course GitHub repo. Okay, and I'm gonna leave a link to that here in this video, but you can also find it right at the beginning of the course. As you see, I already have it opened here. And so all we really have here is this data.json, which is all the data that will be in our laptop store. I have the images, so one image for each of the laptops, and then also the HTML web pages for both the overview and the detail view of each laptop. Okay? All right, and now that you have Node installed on your computer, you can actually run JavaScript outside of the browser for the very first time. So increase this here, clear the console, and so all we have to do is to write in the terminal Node. And so now we're running JavaScript outside of the browser. And this is now basically like a JavaScript console, just like you have in the browser. So we can do JavaScript like 1 + 1, and it will of course give us the result. We can do console logs, for example. And now you notice that I have like this shortcut here on my computer. So when I type "col", then it will write console log automatically. Okay. So I'm going to use that for now. Anyway, you see that this is just JavaScript like you already know. Okay, so good old console log works here in the Node console just as it works in the browser. Now, of course, we don't want to write all of our Node code here in this command line, and so we can create a new JavaScript file to do just that, like we usually do. So creating a new file, and I'm calling this one index.js. Now, what's that? Doesn't really matter. And by the way, if I want to exit this command line here, I just have to type Control-C and then Control-C again. Okay, and that's it. Now let's do the same thing that we did here before in the console, but in this file. So console.log hello world. And now to run this file, I write node again and then index.js. And this works because I'm already in this folder. So this long path here, and so this index.js file is right in that home folder. And so we have to return, and then it runs the file. Okay, simple as that. So what happened here? Well, node run our file, and all we have here is the console log. So it does that here to the console, and then it actually exits the process because it has nothing else to do. And so we're back to our normal command line here in the terminal. So imagine we wanted to add a second console log here, and then we would have to run this all over again. Okay, and this is kind of annoying. So the first thing that you want to do when you start working with Node.js is to install a little tool, like a little helper called nodemon. Okay, and for that we use npm, just as I showed you before in the last part of the course, where I showed you how to use npm and install packages and all that good stuff. So npm install nodemon, and we can actually install it globally. So -g. And if you're on a Mac, you're probably going to need sudo here in front to give it the admin rights. Okay. Now I'm not going to install this because I already have it, but you should go ahead and do that. Okay. So let me get rid of this. And now instead of typing node index.js, all I have to do is to type nodemon. And it will automatically figure out which file I want to run, and then it actually runs it. Okay, so you see here in the log, starting node index.js, which is exactly what we did here before when we did it manually. Now it happens automatically. Okay, and if you now add a third log here, give it a save, and you see it runs automatically here without us having to go ahead and run this again and again each time that we save something. So this is going to save us a ton of time. All right, so this was more the setup of Node.js on our system. Now let's actually start doing something cool. And the first thing that we will do is to read the content of this JSON file here, all right? And then parse it into a JavaScript object. And again, this is something that you really cannot do with a normal, let's say, a JavaScript in the browser, because it doesn't give us access to a file system. But with Node.js, we can. So let me show you how to do it. So get rid of all of this. And the first thing that you need to do is that Node comes with a very powerful module system. And most of the functionality that we have in Node is always in one of the Node packages. So now that we want to read a file, we need to require the file system module. Okay? So we define a variable. In this case, it's going to be fs, which stands for file system, and equal require and then the name of the module, which is fs. And so usually we give the variable name here, fs, the same as the package name. Okay, so the module name. And this is a so-called core Node modules, because we can actually also use other modules, like the ones that we get from npm, but the file system module is something that already comes with Node.js. And so now we're ready to actually load a file. And we do that by saying fs.read file, and we use the synchronous version here. Okay, and so read file here is a method of fs. So, and that's why we had to actually save the result of requiring the module in this variable, so that we can now use this method here that is on that variable. Okay, and so where is that file located? Well, it is here in the data folder and then data.json. Okay, but it's actually not that simple, because we have to pass like the absolute path to that file. And in Node.js, we have a variable name called dir name. Okay, so it's simply called dir name like this. Okay, and since we're using a template string here, because of these backticks here, remember that's something that comes from ES6. We just have to do it like this. Okay, and so this will then get the dir name variable that is defined in Node.js for us. Okay, and so this dir name is basically the home folder, so to say. Okay, so we have dir name /data/data.json. And then we also need to specify the character encoding. Okay, and so that's going to be UTF-8. Okay, and if you don't specify this, then instead of returning a file, it will return something called a buffer. All right, and so finally what we have to do is to then save the result of this into a variable. So let's simply say JSON. Okay, and now let's take a look at this JSON variable with a simple console.log. And since we're doing console logs, let me also show you the dir name variable, just so you know what I was actually talking about. Okay, give it a save now, and here we go. So here is the JSON data that we just read from the file. And you will see that what we have here is exactly what we had here. Amazing, right? So now we can use JavaScript to read files from the disk. And up here you also see the path to this file basically. So index.js is in this huge folder. Okay, so let's get rid of this. And what we actually need is not just like this JSON text, but we want to parse it into an object that we can use in JavaScript. And so we actually want what I'm going to call laptop data, which we will parse with JSON. So in JavaScript there's this JSON.parse method that we can pass any JSON string, let's say, and then it will return an object for us. All right, and I think we actually used this before in another project in this course when we worked with an API. Because APIs usually always work with JSON these days, at least the traditional REST APIs. All right, and now instead of logging JSON, let's actually log our laptop data. And so down here it is, and you see that now it's no longer this string that we had, but it really is a JavaScript object. And so with that, we are ready to start working on implementing this laptop store. Awesome, so we learned how to read files. Now let's actually do what Node.js was really intended to do, which is to create web servers. All right, so for that, we're going to need another package, so another core module, and this one is called HTTP. So again, we're using the variable name as the same one as the module name, require, and HTTP. Get rid of this console.log, and now let's create our server. And so all we have to do is to create a variable called server, and then on the HTTP object, use the create server method. Okay, and there are different ways of doing this, different kinds of writing this, but I think that this one for now and for learning is the easiest one. All right, and in this create server, we have to pass in a callback function. And this callback function is the one that's going to be fired each time that someone accesses our web server. So each time someone like opens a page that's on our server. All right, and this callback function gets access to the request and to the response objects. And more about that later. All right. So we're using an arrow function here, of course, because the Node, just like most browsers these days, also understands ES6, of course. ES6, ES7, ES9, ES8, and all of these versions. They're all kind of well supported in Node.js at this point. Okay, so this creates a server, and remember, this callback function, it is what is run each time that someone accesses our web server. So for now, let's just log to the console. Someone did access the server. Okay, and that is the first part of creating the server. Now the second part is that we actually have to listen on a specific port and a specific IP address. Okay, and again, I'm not going to go into deep explanations here in this quick crash course. Okay, so all we're going to do here is to really try to implement this small project. Okay, and so how this works is that we take the server that we just created here, okay, so this variable here, and then we use the listen method on it. And so this will basically tell Node.js to always keep listening on a certain port on a certain IP address, okay? And so I'm going to use port 1337, and this is kind of a standard in Node. You will also see 3000, 8000, maybe 80. There are some kind of standards, but I'm just going to go with this one here. So that is the port, and now we need the IP address as well. And what we usually do is to use localhost. Okay, so localhost means the current computer, so the computer that the program is right now running on. Okay, and so localhost gets this standard IP address that I'm sure you have seen before. So 127.0.0.1. Okay, and then as soon as we start listening, also this callback function here gets fired. And this is not mandatory. This is just so we know that the server has started listening, okay? So let's just say that we're listening for requests now, okay? And what we did here, which is the most important part, is to pass in this callback function, which will get fired each time that someone accesses the server, okay? And now in order for this to actually start running, we need to actually listen. So basically to look for incoming requests at port 3037 of this IP address, okay? And so let's save this. And now we get listening for requests now. And so let's actually do a request so that we can see if this actually works. And the simplest way of doing that is to actually just use a browser. So we're going to go to this IP and this port and see if it works. 0. And it's actually already here. So just not with this part. And so we see that it's loading, and it doesn't do actually anything right now because we don't have any code here. Okay, in here we don't have any code except the console log, and that actually worked. So someone did access the server. Now this here keeps loading because we're not sending back any result from the server to the browser right now. Okay, and so this will keep spinning here until it eventually times out. Okay, but what we know is that it actually now works, because we got this message here logged to our console. So we can now get rid of this console.log here and actually send a response back from the server. Okay, so just that the page can actually then load something instead of spinning until infinity. Okay, and that is where this response object here comes into play, because both the request and the response objects have certain methods and properties on them that we can now use in order to, in this case, to send a response back to the browser. Okay, so we can use res and then end. Okay, and this is not send, it really is end. And it's end because we can do a couple of things before this. But for now, let's keep it at this. And so let's just say res end and then just some text in here. So this is the response. Okay, so one of the things that we can do before, like I mentioned, is to set a header. Okay, so an HTTP header. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with headers, but they're just like a small message that we send with a request to let the browser know what kind of data is coming in. Okay, so we can say write head and then an HTTP status code, and I write 200 for OK, and then the content type. And it works like this. So we basically pass an object here with some options. So content type. And so let's say that what we're going to send back here will be HTML. Okay, and so this HTTP status code is something that you probably see. For example, if we have an error, we usually have a 404. You know that one, right? And if everything works just fine, then 200 is like a standard for that. Okay, so just a small recap of what's happening here. So each time someone is accessing our server, we will have a response. And to that response, we write a header. Okay, in this case, saying that we have a response so that everything is okay, and that's the 200, and then the content type saying that it's going to be text HTML. And then we also send the response itself. And that always has to happen after setting the header. All right, and so let's see what happens now in this case. So this is what we want, and here we go. So this is the response. What I wanted to do is to show you the network, the network tab. We have to reload this actually to work. And so here you see the status code that we sent back. So the 200, okay. If I were to say 404, and now do it again, then you will see status 404, and it's actually also in red here, saying that we have an error. Okay, the response is still the same, okay, but this just changed the status code of this response simply because we sent a different header. Okay, so just to show you the difference here. So this is the very, very basic functionality of handling requests and sending back responses. Now, before finishing this video, I want to implement something called routing. Okay, and what routing means is that we basically respond in different ways for different URLs. Okay, because right now, no matter what URL we actually have on our server, like this, so we can write something like this, and it doesn't really matter. it will always send back the same response. Okay, it doesn't matter what URL we have here. All right, because we're not responding to that here. We don't have any routing in place. So whatever URL we have, we always send back the same response. But what we really want, and that is what routing really is to respond differently to these different URLs. So for example, here we have /product, and so then we have this overview of all the different products. But if we then click here, we have laptop. So we have /laptop, and so we see the detail page for this specific laptop, okay? And then we also have the ID parameter here, which in this case is 0. But if it was 1, then we would also respond in a different way, because we would now have laptop number 1, laptop number 2, and so on and so forth. And so that exactly is routing. It's responding in different ways to different URLs. All right, and so we go back and we are back to products. And even if we don't have anything here, I also routed that one, so to this same overview. Okay, makes sense? So let's now quickly implement that. And for that, we will have to look at the URL. And so we're going to use a tool for that. So just another Node module. So again, Node comes built in with this functionality that we're going to use, and it's in the URL module. So require, and then URL. And so let's now use this. And where do you think we should use it? Well, it should be right here in this server callback function here. So right in this function. And that is because that's the function that's going to be fired each time that someone accesses the server, right? And so that will always be a different URL. And so this is, of course, where we want to analyze that URL. Okay, and so what we can do is to say URL.parse, and then where is the URL actually stored? Well, now we're going to use the request object for the first time, because that is where the URL is actually stored. And actually, let's comment out this part here and start by having a console log of the request object, just so you get an overview of all the information that we get each time that someone makes a request. So let's reload here. And so this here, all this data that you see, all of this is the request data. Okay, so there's a ton of stuff in here, and somewhere in here is also our URL. So let's actually say URL, do it again, and then here it is. So this is the URL that we typed in here, right? If we just do like products now, just like this, well, then it should say /products. Okay, and we could now actually go ahead and use this one here, but this doesn't quite give us enough functionality, and that is why we use the URL module. Okay, so this here, what we did here, does not even require the URL module that we required up here. Okay, but now it is actually time to use that one, and so I'm going to show you why here in a second. So we will do URL parse of the rec, so of the request URL. Okay, and then we also have to specify a second argument, which is true, which will simply make it so that the query is parsed into an object. Okay, so const, and I'm going to call this one here query, and so let's now log what that actually will do. Do it again, and so now instead of just getting this product string here, we get all of this different stuff here, which for now is probably not so useful, but you will see later why we really need all of this here. Okay, so right now we're actually just interested in the path name here. Okay, so basically what we had here, so we could use in this stage just rec.url without using the URL module here, but again, you're going to see in a second why we actually need this URL.parse. Okay, so this is actually not called query, but I'm going to call it path name. And so what we want here is just the path name. All right, so dot path name. And so let's now just quickly take a look at that, reload, and it should give us products. All right, here we go. And with this, we can actually already start implementing some very simple routing, because all we have to do is to now do an if-else statement. So we can say if the path name is equal to product, then we can do a certain response for that. And later it will of course be all of these different computers, all of this data that we get from this JSON file that we imported right here in the beginning. But for now, just for testing, let's simply write here what we have. So this is the products page, okay? Else if, and let's give us some more space here. We can actually do it like this. It doesn't have to be right here after the first if. And so we can say path name if it is equal to laptop. And here I forgot the slash. It always has the slash in the path name. Okay, so this one is for product and this one is for laptop. So we have laptop, and we're going to take care of that part here in a second. And we have products, and then we also have the products when there's nothing. Okay, so let's also quickly implement that. So if the path name is products, or if the path name is just empty. So in either of these two cases, we will have the product page. And if it says laptop, well, then we have the laptop page. And if we get something entirely different, which is not products or nothing or laptop, well, in that case, we just say that we didn't found the URL. Okay, so basically it's like an error. So we're gonna say was not found on the server. And this is a correct case of using the 404, right? So an error, like I showed you in the beginning. All right, and so let's now actually test this out. So we have products here in the URL, as you see. So reload, and yeah, this is the products page. If we say laptop, whoa, what happened here? So it has to be the capital N, okay. Let's try that again. And this is the laptop page. Awesome. And now the third case, which is nothing. And now we get the URL was not found on the server. So that's not what we want. This is found. And that's actually because here it's not nothing. It is just the slash. Okay. So yeah, now this is the products page. With the products again, we get the product page. With the laptop, we get the laptop page. And if we have something else, then we get URL was not found on the server, and we have the 404 status down here. Okay. Now finally about this this ID parameter that we have here. So basically this ID here is a parameter in the URL. We're also now not responding to that. Okay. So we still get the laptop page, but nothing really happens according to this number. And so let's fix that. And the first step to do that is to actually retrieve this ID from this URL. And so that is where the URL module actually gets really handy. Okay, so let me show that to you. So we got the path name already. And now the query. So that part with the ID equals 1, 2, 3, etc., that is called the query. And so all we have to do is to now use the query. All right, let's now, just to make sure that it makes sense to you, let's again log it to the console here so that you see what we're actually talking about. So let's reload this. And so now you see here that we have query, and then in there we get an object saying ID is 4. So it basically parses, which is exactly the name of the function. So it parses our URL and the query string that we have, and it creates this object saying ID 4. And we can now continue this. So with this format, so and I could say name equals Apple, let's say, and let's also say date equals today. Okay, so just for fun, so that you see what happens here. And so now we have an object with 3 elements, so ID, name, and date, all nicely parsed into an object that we can use. Okay, now in this case, we will only actually use the ID. Okay, and so it's going to look like this. So in the query object, there will be this object with the ID key. And so actually, instead of having this query, we can simply add .id here, and then that will immediately give us the ID that comes from the query string. Okay, makes sense? So that is how we read the ID from our URL. And so with that, we can actually respond to this. So this is the laptop page for laptop, and now the number. So let's do a template string here. So replace this here. ID. And so this should now give us the exact number that we have in the URL, right? So ID 4, and let's wait for it. For laptop 4, great. For 3, 2, and so on and so forth. So awesome. Now in this data JSON, we start with 0, and then we have 4 laptops. So what would happen if we type in the 5 or the 10 or something else? Well, of course, everything works the same. So here we get exactly the number that we type in here. But in the case of this store here, it doesn't make much sense because the last one that we have is with the 4, but with the 5, there is not really a laptop. Okay, and so the response that we want in this case is something like this. Okay, again, because number 5 is not actually the ID of one of our products. Okay, and so how are we going to do that? Well, very simple. We actually just do it here in this routing, in this routing path. Okay, so we say that the path name has to be laptop, and at the same time, the ID must be smaller than laptop data.length. .length, okay? And that is because laptop data is an array, okay? So this data here, it's basically an array of these 5 objects. And so if we have 5 objects in here, then the length of the array will be 5. Okay? And so by having this test, we'll then ensure that this ID here is always smaller than 5. And so right now, if we have 10, well, then we get URL was not found on the server. With 5, we also get the same error, but then with 4, which remember is the last laptop, we get a page for laptop number 4. So awesome. So that is our routing. And that should be actually enough for just one video. And so this is actually very simple, a very simple routing situation. In a real world app, it will get very big with tens, hundreds of routes. And so this code can be quite difficult and it can be quite complicated to do this. And so usually when working with Node, almost everyone, I would say, uses a Node framework called Express to handle routing and to handle lots of other stuff. All right. But I think it's very important to actually understand the basics of the technology, in this case Node.js, before using a framework like Express. All right. And so that's exactly what you're doing here. You're learning the very basics of how we can do this basic stuff with Node.js. It's very exciting to be able to really run JavaScript on the server. So let's wrap up this video here. In the next one, we will then implement basically the visual part and getting all the data from the JSON data that we already imported. Okay, so see you back here in a second. Welcome back. So let's now take care of our application data and the user interface as well by using a technique called templating. So basically we have this HTML template that will then be filled with the data for each of the laptops. So for example, when it's laptop 4, then our template will get filled with all this data, this image, this price, then this data, and also the description. But if we have image 3, for example, then it is a different price, a different image, different data, different name here, and everything changes, but the template is the same, okay? And so what we're going to do now is to take an HTML file that I coded for this page and convert it into a template, which we can then use to replace the data and send that back to the browser. Okay, maybe it sounds complicated, but it's actually quite straightforward. Okay, so let's open up the laptop.html. And so this is the HTML code that I was talking about. I also have the CSS code right in the HTML because that's easier. Okay, and so down here, that is the HTML that we will now replace with some placeholders basically that we can then replace. Okay, so let's create a folder here called templates. And then copy these two into that folder so that we keep the originals here. What happened here? Copy. Yeah, sure, I wanted to paste. So paste them in there, and here we go. Close all of this. Let's rename this also. And the name doesn't really matter. I'm just going to call it template and then the original name. All right. So starting with template overview, or actually template laptop. Let's come down here, and everything that is data, we will now replace with a placeholder. So here we have the price. So let's replace that. And what I'm going to do here as a placeholder is like using a couple of symbols so that we don't accidentally replace something that we actually want to keep. So if we do like this, well, then we can be sure that nowhere else on the page, I actually want this, okay? So now we know that nowhere else on the page will probably be something like this, right? So this is our placeholder. If we just call this price, just like this, maybe there might be some other string exactly like this, and then we would replace something that we actually want to keep. And so with this kind of unique looking text here, that is not going to happen. And so we're always going to use this format here. Okay, then here we want the image. We actually copy this one here, that's easier. Here the slash, and I'm going to explain why here in a second, or actually a bit later in the video, because the image will be something that we will have to fix later. Okay, as the alt text here, we want the product name. Okay, and the product name will be this here, right? So again, later we are going to replace all of this by the data that's going to come from this JSON. So the price, the product name, then image, CPU, RAM, storage, screen, and description. Okay, so the product name here, again, the product name. Then here we have the screen. Then we have the CPU. We have storage. And finally, we have RAM. Then this here is the description. And then finally, again, the price. Okay. Then here I have some emojis, as you're probably noticing. And maybe on your computer they are not working. Maybe you don't have the latest operating system version. And you can just use something else, so you can get rid of the emojis altogether if you don't like them, okay? But anyway, our template here should now be done. And we are now ready to basically load this HTML file, replace all of these placeholders by the real text, and then send that HTML to the browser each time that we request a certain laptop. Okay, makes sense? So let's do that. And it's right here in the laptop route, right? So fs read file again. And this time we're not going to use the sync version. Okay, so many times in Node there are synchronous and asynchronous versions of the same functions. Now I'm not going to go into real deep details here, but the synchronous version is always blocking. So basically it makes the entire code stop for the time that the function is doing its work, and that is going to block the entire thread for all the users that are accessing your code. Because Node.js runs in something called a single thread. And so there's only one thread in the computer that runs your application, no matter if you have 10 users or a million users accessing your app at the same time, okay? So if you block the single thread with a synchronous function that takes up a lot of time, all the other users will have to wait until that function finishes its work. And so usually we always try to use the asynchronous versions, okay? Because then they do the work in the background, And as soon as they're finished, they simply run the callback that we pass into the asynchronous function. Okay, and so that's what we're going to do here. So we have the asynchronous file read, and then we need to pass in the file name of the template that we just created. Again, we have to use the dir name variable, and then templates and template laptop.html. Then the character encoding again, so UTF-8. And now this time, again, we have the callback function in here. And that callback function gets access to at least two parameters, which are error and the read data. Okay, so this time we're not going to save anything to any variable like we did up here in this synchronous file read, but instead we're going to wait until Node finishes reading our file and then calls our callback and passes the data into that callback as the data parameter. So now in here, in this callback, we will have access to that data using this data parameter. Okay? Now up here, we did the synchronous file read here, and I just want to mention this because you might be wondering why the hell we used the synchronous version up here. And we did so because here it is no problem, because this only happens once you start your app, and not while maybe millions or at least thousands of users might be using your app at the same time. Okay? Because remember, each time that someone accesses your code, this is the callback function that is executed. Okay, and so this is where you don't want to block the main thread. But here is no problem because, again, it runs only once when you start up your application. Anyway, what we have here now is basically this HTML read into this data variable, right? So all of this here is now as a string in that data variable. So now all we have to do is to replace, again, these placeholders, as I mentioned before. Okay, and so that's very easy. So let's do that. So let's create a variable here called output, and it's actually a let because we're going to change this basically for each of the placeholders. Okay, so this will be data.replace. It's a very simple string method, and so we say, and let's start here by the product name. And then replace it with the actual data. And what is the actual data? Well, it is the laptop data, right? So that is our array here that we read from the data.json file, and then at the position of the ID. So ID, which is, remember, the ID that we read from our URL. Okay, and so if we read the number 3, well, then we're going to access the laptop data at position number 3. Okay, so we have that laptop now. Imagine that it's number 3, so 0, 1, 2, 3, and what we want is the product name. Okay, dot product name. And let's actually create this variable here outside. So just like this, so take it from here, and so we only have to read it once. And so it's now laptop.productName. Okay, and now all we have to do is to do the same for all the others. Now keep in mind that this replace method here will actually return a new string. All right, so output is now data with the product name replaced. What this means is that when we next want to replace the next placeholder, let's say image, we have to do that in the output from before. Okay? Otherwise, we're going to do it in the original data variable where the product name was not yet changed. Okay, so basically this is like a chain. So first we replace the product name, then in that variable we replace the image, and then the price, the screen, and so on and so forth. Okay? And now we can just duplicate this here a couple of times. So we have image, then we have price, then we have the screen, we have CPU, we have storage, we have the RAM, and then finally we're going to have the description. And I guess that's all for now. All right, now there's just one small issue here, which is that replace only replaces the first occurrence of each of the labels, so of the strings that we're searching for. Now we have this price here, I remember, twice. And so we have to change that. And the way we do it is to actually use something called a regular expression. Okay? And I'm not going to go deep into that here again. You can just always Google a regular expression when you need it. Okay? Now all I'm going to do here is to actually replace these quotes here with a slash. Okay? Because a regular expression always starts and ends with a dash. And then the same here. So all of these here need to go now. And then slash and G. Okay, so again, regular expressions is something that you can just Google. This is not a part of Node.js, it is just a regular JavaScript, all right? And if this here seems a lot of work to you, then of course, as I mentioned before, there are tools in Node.js, and mainly I'm talking about something called Express, which is a framework for Node, which takes some of the pain away from this. So we can use something called template engines, which will make it a lot easier to do this, what we're now doing manually. But again, I think it's a great exercise to learn how things actually work and how you can do everything on your own also, even without using any framework, all right? So we should now have our final HTML in this output variable, and then all we have to do is to actually send this to the browser. So send the response back. So we use the res variable again, so the res object, and then end and output. All right, let's check that out. We have number 4 and we have some kind of error here. So let's check out what's happening. And it says here that output has already been declared. And of course, yeah, this doesn't make any sense. Let's just get rid of all of them. So we only need to declare it, of course, once, and then we're good to go. Try that again, and bam, here we go. So we have our real HTML page here with all the data that is coming from the Samsung Notebook 9. So from number 4. So we have the RAM storage screen, and you will see everything is the same as we have in our data JSON. So that's amazing. That's really great. Number 1 is the Apple MacBook, and now we have 1 terabyte, a 15-inch Retina display, and a 6-core Intel i9. And of course, this huge price. Now, one thing that's missing here is the image, and we're going to fix that a bit later, because that's something a bit particular. And for now, I just want to continue with this templating now for the other part, so for the products. So we have the laptop page now working. Let's go ahead and do the same for the product overview. So basically, this part here. Okay. Now this will be a bit more difficult, because we will basically have a loop which will loop over all of our products, and then for each of them create this HTML for this card here. So if we have only one product, it will only create, of course, one of these product cards. If we have 10, then we want 10 of these product cards. And so we have to do that with a kind of loop. So let's again start by creating the template. Okay, so we have the template overview. And so let's go ahead and do the same as we did before down here in the HTML. All right. And actually, I think I forgot something here, because the product name should also be in the title. So right here as well. Okay, so now if we change, then it also says Dell XPS 13 in the title and also down here. Okay, so that part we didn't have before. Anyway, going back to the template overview, we will now actually have to split it in two. And that's because of what I explained to you a moment ago, which is that we have to create these cards here. All right, so only this part, we have to create this one here in a loop. And we have to create as many as we need according to the number of laptops in our data. And so we need one template for everything that's outside, so that's not the card, so that we have basically that container where we can then put the cards into. Okay, does that make sense? So we'll actually go ahead and cut this here, create a new template, template card.html, and then paste it here. And what we want here in this place is all the cards. So we will create a string basically with all of the HTML for all the cards, and then replace this string with that code which contains the cards. Okay, And so in here, we're actually done. So all we have to replace really is this part, right? Up here, there's nothing really. And then all the data is actually here. So again, we have the image. Let me go ahead and copy this pattern here. Then in the alt, we will have the product name again. Then here the same. Here it's the screen. The CPU, and finally the price. So this one here has a bit less data. Now actually we also need something else, and that is the href for this link. So we want to go to laptop and then remember our query string. So ID equals and then the ID, right? So let me show that to you in the original. So in here, as you can see down there in the corner, right, we will have laptop and then the query ID of ID equals 0, because that will then lead us to the page, as you see then the ID 0, which will then load the data according to the ID, such as we did in the previous step. Okay, and so now in the overview, we will actually have to construct this ID so that it will then take us to the correct laptop that we want to display. Okay, makes sense? So again, the path is laptop and then the ID equals the ID that we're then going to replace. All right, and so that's actually it already, I believe. And so let's go back and do that here in the route for the product, so the product overview. So don't need that. And now we could go ahead and copy a bunch of this code here, but then we would have duplicate code, and that's not ideal. So instead, let's simply create a function for that, which we can then reuse. So that's always the better thing to do, not only in JavaScript, but in programming in general. Right, so let's create function replace template. And so what we need in here is the original HTML, and we need, of course, the laptop. Okay, and so now what I'm going to do is to cut all of this and paste it down here. Okay, just format this selection, and all right, just one minor change that we have to do here, because this is no longer called data now, it is the original HTML, which is coming from this parameter, right? Then in the end, all we have to do is to return the output. Okay, and finally, we also need to replace the ID. Okay, so that's for this part here. This part we didn't yet have here in the code, and so I'm adding that to the replace template function now. So let's use replace template first here in this place, which we already had working. So const output will be replace template, and here we passed in the data and the laptop. All right, and just to see if this actually works, let's just reload this, and indeed it does. So everything works the same, and so we simply exported this functionality into its own function so that we can now do the same with the product overview. Okay, so where do we have that part? Yeah, it's right here. Let's actually add some comments here to make this a bit more legible. So product overview or products. Then the laptop detail, and then URL not found. All right, so that always makes it a little bit easier to understand. So again, we need to do this in two phases, basically, as I explained before. So we first need to basically load all the HTML, which is not in the cart. So basically just everything here around. So the title basically, and then this background. Okay, and so that is just this HTML that we have down here. So just this, and we will then go ahead and replace the cart with the HTML generated using this template. Okay, so again, we need to do this in 2 steps because we want to have a dynamic number of laptops. So I'm just going to go ahead and grab this code here because it's quite similar and there's no need to rewrite all of it. So it's template overview now. And now this part is what we don't need. And now just to check, let's actually simply render what we already have. Okay, and so instead of render output, it's now render the data. So this parameter here. Okay, so let's try that out. So products is our route. And here we go. So we have the title, and then we have this string here that we now in the next step need to replace with our cards. So I can actually go ahead and copy this again and then have it in here. Okay, and so this callback function here basically, so this new one here needs to be inside the first one because we only want to read the card template as soon as the overview template has been read. Okay, so basically to create a sequence here. All right, so this is now template cards or card. This is no longer needed because we're not going to send the data just here without the cards in there. And so let's now loop through all of our different laptops and create the template for each of them. All right, and that should be fairly easy as well. So laptop data, remember that is the array where all of our laptops are stored, so all the objects for each of the laptops. And so we do a simple map. And remember that map is an array method which loops through the array, and in each iteration it saves the result of the callback function into a new array. Okay, and so we need to actually save this here to a new variable. Output, all right. So we've been calling this always output, and so this one is the cards output, all right? So we want to loop through the laptop data, and for each element, what we're going to do is to use our function. So our replace template function that we used before, and so now it's really handy that we did this function, all right? Because all we need to do now is to pass in the cards HTML, so data, and then the laptop, which in this case is the current element called AL, right? So remember, we need to pass in the original HTML and the laptop. And in this case, the original HTML is this data that we read for the card, and the element is the current element of this iteration through the laptop data array. All right, so let's just log this to the console here, just so that it makes 100% sense to you. I'm not sure it does at this point. And so let's just reload. This looks a bit weird, but don't worry. Right now, I'm only interested in the output here. And so you see that we have now the HTML for all these cards. So it's an array actually, so an array of all these strings. So we have the card, then here we have the next element, so the next element in the array, a new card, and so we will have 5 cards for all the 5 laptops. Okay, makes sense? Now we want this actually in a string, and so all we have to do is to say join, and again we did this before, so this is nothing new really. So we join this with an empty string, and if I reload this now, you will see that the output is simply a huge string with all of this HTML. So perfect. So what is the next step that we need to do? Well, all we have to do now is to replace that cards placeholder, so this one here, with this HTML that we just generated. Okay, so this data here. And so let's actually give it a name here. Let output equal the data. All right. And so now all we have to do is to change that output so that original data here, so the overview output, and let's actually call it overview output to make it a little bit less confusing, I guess. So the overview output will be overview output dot replace, and so the string is this one, and now we don't have to worry about any regular expressions because there's only going to be one of this. So we want to replace this placeholder by the cards, or with the cards output. And now all we need to do is to render that overview output. And that should be it. Okay, let's try it out. And bam, here we go. Amazing, right? All that's really missing is the image again, but again, I'm gonna fix that in a minute. But for now, just see how it actually dynamically on the fly generated this page based on our data. And if I go ahead and remove one of them, of course, let's say I remove this Dell product here, just get rid of it. If I now reload, then it's of course gone, and now we only have these 4 left. So really, it does it automatically, dynamically, and on the fly. So that is the power of Node.js and JavaScript on the server. As you see, you can really recycle 90% of what you already know of JavaScript and take it to the server to build these back-end applications without any problem. So now it's back, and it's back here as well. Okay, and with everything now working, the last thing that we have to fix is these images not working. So let's actually take a look at them, inspect them, and try to figure out what is not working here. So for all of this, we have this error message. The server responded with a status of 404 not found. So why does this actually happen? Well, it does happen because Node.js doesn't serve any files by default. Every URL is always like a route. And so, for example, if we have this image here, for Node.js, this is just a simple request. Okay, so let's try to figure out what happens if we were to simply put it in here, like this. Then we will get the URL was not found on the server. All right, maybe you're thinking that's because it is in the image folder in data. All right, so let's try that out. Because you might think that this part here is like the home folder, and then we need to simply type data/image, and that's it. But that is not how it works actually. All right, because on the Node.js server, this concept of folders and files does not really exist. So everything is like a request. And if we request this image here, well, then we need to kind of respond to that request as well. But right now we only request to the products route and to the laptop route, right? And so we now need basically a route for images as well, so that we can then serve these images on these requests. Okay, and to illustrate this even more, let's go ahead and log this path name here. Okay, and so now you will see that there is not just one request, right? So there's not just a request for these products, but also for style.css and for these 5 images. Okay, so we loaded that page, but that is not the only request. All of the resources that are on the page are also requests, and we need to respond to them if we want to display something based on them, right? So in this case, these images. We also have this style here, but let me just get rid of that. It's probably here in one of these templates. Yeah, right here. That is actually the reason why I did the style inline. So I put it, all the styles right in the HTML files so that we don't have to deal with CSS as well, because then we would have to need yet another route, and that's not really practical. All right. So again, with these frameworks like Express.js, this is a lot easier. You don't have to really do this manually. But once again, I like to really understand how and why things work the way they do. And I think it's also very beneficial for you as well. Okay, so let's now try to do a route for images in general. Of course, we're not going to do a route for each of them individually, right? We're going to have a general route that works for all of the images. So what we want here is another route. So images, else if. And now what we need here is basically a true false value indicating if the resource that we're requesting is an image. Okay, and again, if you need something like this, you can always Google like regular expression to find image extension. Okay, so basically that's what I did for this, because it's really difficult and time intensive to really learn how regular expression works. All right, I find it easier to just Google it. Okay, so we always start the regular expression with slash and end it with slash, and then in there, there's some kind of magic happening. And in this case, it works just like this. So basically, we test if there is an extension, which is the dot. So if there is a dot, JPEG, or maybe a JPEG written with E, because sometimes you see that, or a PNG, because we actually have a PNG, this one here. And let's say we might have a GIF or a GIF, I don't know. And so let's add that here as well. Then we need this $sign here for some reason /I. All right. And so this is our regular expression. And we will now test if our path name contains basically this regular expression. So we say .test, which is a method that is available on all regular expressions in JavaScript. And then our path name. This one I don't need. And okay. So this here is our regular expression again. And we will now test if our path name, which is, for example, this one here, this one or this one, we will test if it contains .jpeg or .jpeg or .png or .gif. All right. And if it does, well, then we're going to read that image and serve it, or basically send it back as the response. Okay. So let's just do that. So read file. Then again, we need the dir name. And now where is this image? So imagine that we have a MacBook Pro 15.jpg as the request. So what we need then is to go into our folder /data/image and then our path name. Makes sense? Because that is the name of the image that we're actually trying to read. Okay. Now this time we're not going to do the character encoding because this is not text, it's just an image. Okay, and so now all we have to do is to pass in the callback function, which will be called as soon as we're done reading the image. And again, it's important that this happens asynchronously, and so that's why we're using the read file and not read file async. All right, now as soon as we're done reading that data, all we have to do is to really send the head as always. And this type, let's just do image and then JPEG. Okay, so that's the content type. There are many, and one of them is image /JPEG. So the type of data and then the file extension actually. All right, and then as always res and then end and the data. Okay, now in a real world application we should also have some error handling in place. And that's why we always have access to this error here as well. So imagine that the image that we're trying to read is not really there. Well, then we would have an error and we could handle that error. But here in this case, we're just going to assume that everything works just fine. All right. Okay, let's now test this. Reload. And bam! Our images are now there. Still one error. Don't know what that is. It's just a CSS for some reason. Take a look. Maybe it is in here as well. No, it's not. The overview also shouldn't have it anymore. Okay. It's here. Can now close all these templates. Don't need them anymore. Reload. And yeah, so now we have no error and we have our images here as well. So again, each of these images is a separate request. And we're handling that request, each of the requests actually, here in this route. So this route handles images with the JPEG, PNG, or GIF format. So as soon as we have one of these extensions in our URL, well, we will read the image from the file system and send it as a response to the browser. And so then, like this, the browser is able to, of course, display them on the page. And it's going to work, hopefully, on these as well. And it does. So now we have the images here, just like in our original store, which we can now close. And let's also actually try it like here. And indeed, our image is also now here. So we can do this simple request here, and our image is going to show up just like this. All right. Well, what's going on here? Not really sure. It's not called, it's really called products. And back. Okay, there's still an error in that code. So in the HTML. So let's open up that laptop, and here should be a link. Yeah, and it sends back to overview.html, and that's of course not correct. what we want is to send it back to product, right? So reload this here, and now, as you can see down there here, it will send us back to product, and here we go. So the Samsung, and here we see the Samsung, and yeah, it now works. So the project is really finished now. Awesome, that's really, really cool. And of course, we only barely scratched the surface here of Node.js, all right? So this is really just the absolute fundamentals of what you can do with it. But I think it was still very exciting, and I hope you found it useful, and hopefully you're gonna want to learn more after this. And if you do feel that Node.js is something you like, or something you might find useful in the future, well, let me tell you that I will actually be working on a brand new Node.js course over the next couple of months. All right, so that course will have a ton more explanations than just this small crash course. It will have a lot of theory lectures so that you really understand how Node.js works behind the scenes, and of course a huge real-world project where you're going to learn everything about Node.js, Express, which is a framework that I just talked about, and also use MongoDB as a real database instead of just storing data in text files. So of course, usually the data comes from databases, not just text files like we did here. Okay, so that course will be available sometime in first half of 2019, hopefully. All right, so I hope you can wait for that. And in the meantime, just keep coding, keep building great projects, and keep learning every day. All right, so I hope to see you soon in some of my next videos or courses. And until then, have a good time.